Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with another huge week of World War III analysis. The U.S. continues to lurch towards war with Iran as talks of negotiations heats up. Iran claims to have rejected direct negotiations with the U.S., but increased pressure, direct movements of U.S. forces, as well as the strikes on the Houthis, some are claiming, has prompted the Iranians to perhaps reconsider direct negotiations. We're going to be discussing all of that, as well as Israel's dramatic expansion in all directions as they level suburbs of Beirut and Lebanon, as they do some of their most dramatic strikes on Gaza since the immediate days after October 7th, as well as strike deep into Syria, supposedly to deter Turkey from developing more military bases there. We are also going to discuss Marco Rubio's latest remarks regarding the Russia-Ukraine negotiations, give frontline updates there, discuss the ongoing situation with Turkey, as of course their relations with Iran, Russia, Azerbaijan even are going to affect, our prophetic perspective. Here on the show, we're going to be discussing a lot of things in Europe. Marine Le Pen arrested, new alliances being formed between Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, these other places. Of course, we're going to go to Africa, also discuss what's going on in Libya, some big updates there, as well as in the Congo and Rwanda. Of course, there have been massive Chinese drills around Taiwan as China continues to, call out the U.S. for using Taiwan against them. We're going to discuss how this might also be tying into the Iran situation, as China, of course, is a direct ally. We have some church news to discuss as well, with Mike Pompeo getting a very prestigious award from the ecumenical patriarch himself. So a lot of things to discuss. Be sure to check out this week's Ether Hour as well with Anthony of Westgate. We discuss the Jewish roots of the Protestant Reformation, how the Kabbalah, the Talmud influenced some of the early reformers, the alchemical factor, the early roots of Christian Zionism, and a number of other things. Also, be sure to check out the replay of my World War live streams, which are every Tuesday evening at 7:45, and be sure to prepare for the next one every Tuesday evening. Like I said, I'm going to be live answering super chats and questions, so be sure to check all of that out. Obviously, get behind the paywall to hear the full episode with Anthony, worldwarnow.co. All of that, of course, is going to be linked below. But with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It's been a very eventful week, of course. Probably a bit less eventful than last week, but diplomatically speaking, no less significant, especially as we see what's happening in the Middle East escalate to a point of essentially almost no return. We see Iran trying to diplomatically pivot out of its certain situation. We see the HTS-led oppositionary government in Syria. Well, I still call it oppositionary because Bashar al-Assad is still in Russia in safe hands. But however, the government in Syria is trying to escape. It's between a rock and a hard place. You have pressure from Turkey. You have Israeli politicians, actually officials from the cabinet, accusing the HTS al-Jilani al-Shara government of being a protectorate government of Turkey, a vassalate, essentially. And you have official Israeli politicians accusing them of that whilst they're bombing Syrian bases, Syrian suburbs in the southern province of Deraa, which is very close to where the Israelis are holding their current forces in Syria, which is what Israel is calling an extended buffer zone, past the Golan Heights, areas which Israel, frankly, never controlled throughout its entire history, even during the wars of past decades in the 20th century. So quite an unprecedented positioning for the Israeli forces, and they're using it to their advantage. They're essentially bombing arms depots, the airport at Damascus. They're very close to it, so they're just running their planes, flying them over the areas, bombing indiscriminately. Seems to be no particular air defense that this new Syrian government, the oppositionary HTS government, has installed anywhere. So Israel is frankly doing what it pleases in a similar way to Gaza. In fact, we can almost say southern Syria has been turned into this new Gaza Strip. In some ways, it's even less safe than the West Bank, which is frankly surprising because we do know the Zionist aspirations, and especially the radical settlers, the militias, and even the police not helping the local Palestinian people, especially when they're facing such persecution from the local Zionists and those who are moving in, trying to force them out of their homes. So it's a very precarious situation, especially considering that many from North Syria, especially as the Idlib province essentially opened its gates and all the terrorists began to stream to the south, many refugees from northern Syria actually traveled down south to Damascus. So Damascus is full of people. Its provinces are full of, essentially, it's almost like from the time of Christ when Emperor Augustus announced the census and everyone in Judea and Samaria moved to their respective provinces. And of course, Christ's family, Joseph and Mary, moved to Bethlehem for the massive census where Christ was born. You see the same situation in Syria. Damascus is full of people. There isn't enough, I would say. No one's working. Really, people are just crowded in homes. Now you have Israel indiscriminately bombing these areas. It's quite intense. And I think we're going to see perhaps even a new Israel escalation of sorts if it doesn't reach a potential deal with Turkey. And I think Turkey is going to be one of the main subjects we discussed this week, Conrad, because frankly, Turkey is really trying to establish itself as a dominant player in this Middle Eastern scenario, in this central Middle East, Syria, the heart of the Middle East. At the same time, it's facing a lot of internal pressure. And frankly, now it almost seems, Conrad, like the protests in Turkey, which I think we'll get into in a little bit, were caused in part by pressure from some of these institutions, which of course influence young people collectives in order to apply pressure to the Turkish government and cabinet in Istanbul and in Ankara through the protests, essentially stating that, look, Erdogan, you may appear to be an independent sovereign actor. Yes, you're a powerful member of NATO, but we still have a strong grasp over the culture in your country, over the people. Your government is still subservient to us. And us as, of course, the globalists, the Talmudic power players, the money movers and money changers of the world. So it's a very interesting scenario taking place. And of course, while all this is happening, the Gaza bombing is increasing. And we've seen funerals from both Syria, southern Syria and Damascus, as well as Gaza. The UN has announced that at least 2/3 of Gaza are essentially, according to Israel, no-go territories. So Palestinians simply cannot enter these territories. Those who still remain cannot exit without any sort of risk to their livelihood. And of course, many of the apartment buildings in Gaza are currently set for demolition. According to some Israeli spokespersons, Israel essentially views Gaza as this massive demolition field that needs to be destroyed, blown over. And of course, there's people's personal property, housing, homes that they've built, homes that they've invested into, purchased over time. All this is going to be neglected by whatever government takes place in Gaza, whatever government is installed, if, say, Hamas does lose this current battle. So it's looking very difficult and complex for the local people, and it's a huge humanitarian crisis. And we have at least 100 Gazan Palestinians have died this week, probably a lot more, which we still haven't heard of. So Israel's bombardment really is taking place on all sides, as you mentioned, in Lebanon as well. It's looking like Israel is really the dominant player in the Middle East. So insofar as, we expected Iran to do a bit more, but I think Iran is in a very complicated situation. It's trying to fend off the international aggression that may come from the US and some of its allies in that region. So very complicated situation and quite precarious.
No, definitely. And 5 days ago, we had the big news. This is from the AP. Iran has rejected direct negotiations with the U.S. in response to Trump's letter. Iran's president said Sunday that the Islamic Republic rejected direct negotiations with the United States over its rapidly advancing nuclear program, offering Tehran's first response to a letter that U.S. President Donald Trump sent the country's supreme leader. President Masoud Pezeshkian said that Iran's response, delivered via the Sultanate of Oman, left open the possibility of indirect negotiations with Washington. However, such talks have made no progress as Trump, in his first term, unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from Tehran's nuclear deal with world powers in 2018. In the years since, regional tensions have boiled over into attacks at sea and on land. Then came the Israel-Hamas war. So, that was 5 days ago. That was the big headline. But more recently, of course, we, saw the strikes on the Houthis escalate. We saw the U.S., of course, move more and more B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia, more and more Patriot defense systems, other bombers, other missile systems that would be protecting the U.S.'s regional bases across, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and of course, Israel itself. A lot of transport planes were moving in, from Europe over into CENTCOM across the U.S.'s bases in the Middle East. But very recently, Trump said that he thinks Iran will accept direct nuclear talks. We heard that Iran has been speaking with the Swiss ambassador, who pretty much represents U.S. interests in Iran, as of course there is no U.S. embassy. But obviously we know that there have been a lot of rumors spreading. There was a story published, I can't remember where, if it was in an American or a British publication, but it basically said that Iran is going to halt its support for the Houthis, is openly abandoning the Houthis, I guess, to favor goodwill with the United States. Yet a lot of sources that I trust said that they have sources on the ground in Yemen that don't think that is true, that have not heard anything about that. So again, the disinformation and the demoralization from the media, as well as, look, we know who owns the media. It's Jews. And so people that are disproportionately loyal to Israel are going to be trying to wage, an information war, because we know that's just as important a part of the Third World War as, actual troop movements on the map and missiles flying through the air and ships at sea. But I think a big question that not as many people are talking about in the midst of all of this, of course, this is from the Jerusalem Post, and they are, of course, very pro-Likud, very pro-Netanyahu, very pro-Chabad. And so sometimes they come off as very conservative, sometimes even perhaps a little bit multipolar. But The headline is, can Putin deliver on mediating on Trump's nuclear talks with Iran? Russia does not have sufficient influence to coerce Khomeini into succumbing to Trump's ultimatum and rolling back its nuclear program. And, there seems to be a sort of, again, this might also be a Likud wish casting saying how, look, Putin, Russia, they really love us and they want to support us, but they just don't have the influence to, tell Iran to stop. Whereas I think on the show, we've made it very clear that Russia is too cozy with the Israelis, specifically Netanyahu and Likud through the Chabad connection. But ultimately, Putin is a true realist in a lot of these ways, which in many ways makes him not super quote unquote base, but it also, makes him not exactly a puppet either. And they know that their relations with Iran and China are very important. But one of the big escalations that Israel has done, of course, is not only have they resumed the Gaza genocide, they have also increased the amount of strikes, the heaviness of the strikes. We're seeing some of the heaviest strikes in Gaza since the war began. From Dave DeCamp, this says Israeli strikes in Gaza kill more than 100 in a single day. U.S.-backed Israeli attacks on Gaza on Thursday killed more than 100 Palestinians. Medical sources told Al Jazeera a relentless strike pounded areas across the Strip. Attacks on Thursday included the bombing of a school-turned-shelter for displaced Palestinian civilians in Gaza City. According to the Anadolu agency, at least 29 people were killed in the strike. Footage of the aftermath of the attack shows dead and wounded children. Gaza's government media office said the dead included 18 children, women, and elderly people, and more than 100 were wounded. The occupation has committed a new massacre against displaced persons by bombing Dar al-Arqam school in Gaza City. So, the Jews are back to bombing schools, and Israel Katz is also making it very clear that the Gazans will be expelled. This is from Kyle Anzalone. Palestinians will be removed from Gaza after Hamas eliminated. According to Haaretz, a senior Israeli official who is traveling with Prime Minister Netanyahu, explained what we would like to see is that we rescue the hostages, eliminate Hamas, and that there's a large-scale opportunity for voluntary migration. On Thursday, the Times of Israel reported that Hamas again offered to release all captives in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. The outlet explained that Tel Aviv has a long-standing rejection to this type of deal. So when Jews online or Jews in the media say, they just need to release the hostages, Hamas won't release the hostages. Hamas has been willing to release the hostages, I think, since pretty much day one. The Israelis and Netanyahu specifically know that if that actually happened and there was a ceasefire, that Hamas would not be quote unquote disempowered or destroyed. And then, of course, it would be impossible to legally ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and push them into Egypt, Syria, Somaliland, Indonesia, wherever it is that, these people want to push them. So, that's what's going on in Gaza. But not only are they dramatically escalating in Gaza, but the defense minister, Israel Katz, also said, this is from Jason Ditz, no time limit to the occupation of southern Lebanon as strikes continue. During a visit to the border village of Margaliot, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz urged northern Israelis to return to their communities by assuring them that Israeli troops would continue to occupy military outposts inside Lebanese territory, insisting that the occupation has no time limit. Large numbers of Israelis to the southern parts of the country in the lead up to September's invasion of Lebanon, and many have been resistant to the idea of returning home. The government is pushing the narrative that it is perfectly safe, though not because there have effectively been no rockets successfully fired into Israel during the ceasefire. Rather, the government is pushing the idea that their occupation of southern Lebanon is open-ended, so it's safe in that respect. Obviously, the Lebanese officials, the president, the prime minister, Hezbollah, everybody's in agreement that this is unacceptable. But fundamentally, the Maronite Christian forces, a lot of these Sunni forces in Lebanon care more about getting rid of their domestic political enemies in Hezbollah and in these Shia groups than they do about actually confronting Israel or protecting the Palestinians. And that is unfortunately shameful. And of course, there was this huge strike in Dariyeh, the southern suburb of Beirut, which is sort of a Hezbollah stronghold that supposedly killed a high-ranking Hezbollah official who had been planning some sort of strikes into Israel, at least according to Tel Aviv. They didn't give any warning for the strike, and it was completely unannounced. And multiple civilians ended up being killed because it was in the middle of a crowded suburban area, which, again, this is how they like to operate. Supposedly, Naim Qassem, the head of Hezbollah, has been considering how to respond. And again, there were news stories. I think this might have been from Israeli sources, so don't quote me as saying this is accurate, but they claim that Qassem has opted not for a strike from Lebanese territory, but from a strike from Iraq, with Hezbollah working, I'm assuming, with the Shia Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, which the Iraqi government, supported by the U.S. at one point, claimed that they were forcing them to disband. But then there were Israeli reports of missile batteries being moved around in Iraq to supposedly launch at Israel. We haven't seen anything like that directly happen yet, but perhaps by the time you're listening to this, strike from Iraq will have occurred. But the other main strikes from Israel that, have been very relevant. I think Menarn is being talked about in the news. This is from Reuters. Israel hit Syrian bases scoped by Turkey, hinting at regional showdown, sources say. Turkey scoped out at least 3 air bases in Syria where it could deploy forces as part of a planned joint defense pact before Israel hit the sites with airstrikes this week, 4 people familiar with the matter said. The bombardment signals the risks of a deepening rift between 2 powerful regional militaries over Syria, where Islamist rebels have installed a new government after toppling former leader Bashar al-Assad in December. The Israeli strikes on the 3 sites Turkey was assessing, including a heavy barrage on Wednesday night, came despite Ankara's efforts to reassure Washington that a deeper military presence in Syria was not intended to threaten Israel. The Islamists replacing Assad have alarmed Israel, which is wary of an Islamist presence on its border, and has lobbied the United States to curb Turkey's growing influence in the country. Ankara, a longtime backer of opposition to Assad, is positioning to play a major role in the remade Syria, including with a possible joint defense pact that could see new Turkish bases in central Syria and use of Syria's airspace. In preparation, Turkish military teams in recent weeks visited the T4 and Palmyra air bases in Syria's Homs province and the main airport in the Hama province, according to regional intelligence officials, 2 Syrian military sources, and another Syrian source familiar with the matter. The sources spoke on the conditions of anonymity, yada yada. Turkish teams evaluated the states of the runways, hangars, and other infrastructure at the bases, the regional intelligence official said. Strikes at T4 destroyed the runway, tower, hangars, and the planes that were grounded. It was a tough message that Israel won't accept the expanded Turkish presence. T4 is totally unusable now, said a Syrian source who is close to Turkey. When asked about the visits, Turkish Defense Ministry officials said reports and posts regarding developments in Syria, whether real or alleged, that do not originate from official authorities should not be taken into consideration. So, the clash between Turkey and Israel continues to grow closer, despite the fact that Turkish foreign ministry groups insist that they would not oppose Syria pursuing normalization and bilateral relations with Israel, that all of their operations in Syria, whether it be their actual occupation of Syrian territory in the north or their expanded access to these bases, they claim it is entirely about anti-terrorist purposes. Obviously, that means confronting Kurdish groups. But this came recently as well. Today, actually, April 4th. This is from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ankara is not interested in a new source of instability in the region and opposes a possible U.S. attack on Iran. So again, Israel, in its aggression against Turkey also, and in its escalations against Iran, is causing these formerly Islamic enemies to sort of find common cause. Obviously, the Gaza situation, the fact that it's taken this long for these groups to kind of coalesce is saying something. But again, I'm still very skeptical of Turkey, and perhaps Erdogan would be legitimate in normalizing with Iran to pursue common cause in Syria, Gaza, or at least be sort of united against Israel. However, I wouldn't be surprised if Israel dramatically escalated its support for potential regime change in Turkey. And I think a lot of that could depend on, potential situations with Azerbaijan, which we're going to talk about in a second. But I'd love to know your thoughts on these Turkish strikes or these Israeli strikes on these Turkish bases in Syria, as well as just the other current state of the greater Israel expansion we're witnessing right now.
Yeah, I think Israel's unaccountability to, frankly, anyone, not the Biden administration nor the Trump administration as we see now. Trump has really shown some spine. I guess we'll talk about that a bit later when we discuss economics and tariffs that Trump is installing. But in relation to Israel, he's still essentially the dog being walked, right? According to Alish, it's clear that Israel is perhaps in an unequal relationship with the US in terms of its capacity and the aid that it receives. It's really, you can almost say the decision maker in the particular, it wears the pants in this particular situation. But I think what's really striking is just the fact that Israel is acting as if really there's no opposition. And you mentioned the presence of Chabad in Moscow and the Kremlin, the fact that Russia really does seek to retain its 2 bases that it invested in Syria. And it seems like Turkey, whatever its relationship with Israel, as difficult as it is, Turkey does understand that Israel may be one of its allies in this long-term economic or potentially even geopolitical conflict with Egypt, because Turkey does have these long-standing relations with the Muslim Brotherhood. Some people say that even Erdogan has direct influence. He's either influenced or he does influence the Muslim Brotherhood jointly with Qatar. And so you do have the Egyptian publications essentially always promoting this conspiracy that Erdogan is this secretive member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he essentially does support Hamas secretly. And of course, Egypt really dislikes Hamas very heavily. This new regime in Egypt, this militaristic regime that came to power for a coup. And so I think Israel, understanding that, really is trying to position itself as like a power play in Syria, doesn't want to give Turkey too much, right? I think we also understand that Turkey is in a balancing act. I think I heard Syrian Girl actually mention this in an X Space quite recently, that the main leverage point against Turkey. It's not just the political instability in the main cities of Ankara and Istanbul, in particular in Istanbul, because Istanbul remains the religious and cultural hub of Turkey. It's not just an administrative center like Ankara is. Any protest in Istanbul has a lot more weight than any other city. And Izmir, for example, is just despite the fact that it's a huge city, it's very provincial in terms of geopolitics and the influence it has on local Turkish political affairs. But we do see, for example, Turkey trying to deal through HTS with the Kurdish question. It's the Kurds who Israel is also trying to influence. It's the Kurds, again, working very closely with the US, are the main leverage point that Syria has. It's not even the local Sunnis, not even HTS. The main concern I think that Turkey has with Syria is the Kurdish question. And I think Israel is trying to, potentially through the David corridor, connecting itself with the Kurds, Israel is trying to position itself in a bargaining situation. Like, look, we'll take a portion of Syria under our protectorateship, create a buffer zone, but Turkey, you won't be, for example, challenging us in this area. And is the rhetoric Israel is using, notice it's always pointing towards the Islamic factor. It's positioning itself as the keeper of law, as the fighter against this Sharia-dominated regime of HTS, despite the fact that it's very clear to us at this point, Conrad, that Israel assisted HTS into coming to power. It also assisted ISIS, more than a decade ago, and it continues to help the Syrian government unofficially. However, on the ground, Israel is bombing some of these bases. It is bombing the terrorists in Idlib. Most of these bases, by the way, that it's bombing, that are Turkey-related, Conrad, they're, of course, very heavily stationed by Turkish troops, Turkish officers. We know that the Syrian rebels were wearing literal Turkish uniforms when they marched out of Idlib in December. And then, of course, they attacked all those cities held by Bashar al-Assad's sovereign Syrian Arab army. So we understand that Turkey does have a large role to play in the HTS rulership over Syria. And unfortunately speaking, I don't think Turkey really has as much leverage as Israel does, frankly, because Israel does have a very close, cozy relationship with Azerbaijan. Israel at the moment is very much friendly with Russia, which Turkey is trying to normalize relations with. And from what we've seen, Israel is completely happy to allow the HTS regime to exist because it creates this constant tension in the Golan Heights area, giving Israel an excuse to not only keep a large mobilized force in power, but also, of course, to always stay in this heightened state to mobilize their society in general. Because we know Israeli society is almost like a two-sided coin here. It's on one side, it's very highly liberal and degenerate. On the other side, it's very militaristic and right-wing from a very Zionist perspective. So in order to keep the right-wing sort of in power, to keep it dominant over their society, they need a constant threat. They need an enemy at their border. And if that enemy stops being the Palestinians, if they deal with Hamas and they, of course, sort out Hezbollah in the north, they're going to need that outside enemy to continue to exist. In this case, it'll be the HTS regime. It'll be Syria. So for Israel, this is a perfect scenario, but it just needs Turkey not to normalize whatever's going to take place in Syria. It can't, if Turkey, for example, annexes half of Syria and claims that this is like a new Turkish buffer state, like a Donetsk, Lugansk type of situation, which we've seen precedent for all over the world at this point with Respublika Srpska, with the new SMO zones. All kinds of countries are annexing and essentially connecting adjacent territories to their main sovereign zones. So again, if Turkey does the same in Syria, I think Israel won't be too happy with that because it needs a destabilized area full of terrorists who it can, of course, exploit. The other very interesting news from Syria in particular is the fact that we have clear indication that Russia has been shipping oil, crude oil in particular, from the ports at Murmansk to the new Syrian regime. So notice Russians trying to normalize with HTS. At the same time, we have Iran stopping all oil and gas shipments to Syria since the fall of Bashar al-Assad, which is quite curious. But Russia, nevertheless, has still continued to ship oil and sell it probably for very cheap to some of the ports on the west coast of Syria. In particular, there's a ship from Barbados, which is, of course, flagged as a Barbados ship, but we know it was made in Russian ports, the Aquatica, and there is also the Sakina. Both of them carry at least 100,000 tons of oil. Both of them have shipped in March. They've arrived in Syria. They've delivered oil, which the HTS regime has purchased. There's also much smaller ships that have arrived. For example, the Prosperity tanker. It used to, literally carry oil during even the Soviet Union. These are very old ships, but they've been arriving from these various places around the world, making short stops in order to mask their true origins. But they are coming from the Russian Northern Arctic zone. They are coming from Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, from the Russian Arctic. So very interesting that Russia continues to sell these particular goods to the new Syrian regime. And I think Israel is noticing that. And they're quite taken aback by the fact that Russia's happy to normalize with the Islamists. I think that may be like that black swan relation that Russia does have in the region, Conrad, is Russia's normalization of the Sunni extremist Muslims. We see this in Chechnya, for example, which is heavily pro-HTS. And I think Chechnya to this day remains this wild card in Russia's domestic politics, I think, given the fact that they can always be radicalized by these hardcore Salafi and maybe even, God forbid, Wahhabi ideologies, as we've seen in recent years. And I think Israel is very cautious in how it deals with Russia. Russia perhaps is even using this normalization of HTS as a potential move in the future against Israel. Again, this is highly speculative because Russia has been on the retreat, politically speaking, in the Middle East. But I think the downside to trying to use HTS against Israel, Conrad, is the fact that Iran clearly isn't happy with the regime that took power in Syria. And Iran clearly, Russia's going against the status quo of the axis of resistance. Clearly, Russia's showing that it's not a part of the axis. It's not necessarily even cooperating with the Houthis in Yemen, for example. Like, remember when they established their embassy not in the capital city of Sana'a with the Houthis, but in the oppositionary city in Yemen? That was a clear sign. Also, Russia's selling oil, whilst Iran is essentially cancelling its oil sales. And of course, when we discuss sanctions and the economic downturn, it's the fact that oil has reduced in price over the last few days thanks to Trump's tariffs by 6 to 7% worldwide. This will have huge implications on not just the Iranian economy. Of course, Iran sells oil and gas to China, but also on the Russian economy, which deeply depends on these fossil fuel sales. So a lot of very interesting dynamics. But as you said, Conrad, the big question is, whose side is Russia on? And I don't even think the Russian politicians necessarily know that. I think they're very much playing almost everyone against each other, and they're just trying to win out in the end. But I think the sort of 6D chess won't really go far if your bases are threatened, and which I think we'll see in the near future if Russia really pisses off and angers the new HTS regime. I think those two bases are under deep threat, especially the footage we've seen recently from Khmeimim does show that Russia does not have that many planes there. The airport is basically empty. So what exactly does Russia need those bases for if it's not going to station any troops or aircraft there? It's a big question mark.
Those are all really important questions. And you mentioned the Houthi situation. I'm going to talk about Azerbaijan and Russia and Iran here in 1 second. But the Houthi situation betrays the other one of Russia's, I think, unwise allies. The first one being Azerbaijan, of course. The Russians need to stop being so close with them. And the other one being the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates are the biggest Shabbos Goyim in the Muslim world. And they even fund interests that go against the Russians in places like Sudan, because the Russians, of course, have decided to side with the junta, the Sudanese armed forces, and that's how they're going to get their Red Sea base, while the UAE continue to fund the Rapid Support Forces. The UAE, again, they fund, I don't know if it's the Southern Transition Council, I think that might be them, and then there's the Saudi-backed proxy in Yemen as well, but the Russians aren't siding with their Iranian allies. But part of the reason I think the reports that Iran is apparently abandoning the Houthis are totally fake are because fundamentally, despite the fact that the Houthis have taken some personnel losses and Yemen is getting struck very hard, the Pentagon and the US know that the Houthis can't be defeated with air power alone. And this is from Kyle Anzalone again. The Pentagon admits the strikes have limited success in Yemen, coming at high cost. DoD officials are telling Congress behind closed doors that it does not believe the new military campaign in Yemen has degraded the Houthis' military capabilities. Within a month, the operations will cost over $1 billion. According to the New York Times, the Pentagon informed Capitol Hill that the new operations against the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, have had limited success. The Houthis have reinforced their underground bunkers, frustrating the White House. The private assessment of Congress is far different from the public message from the White House. These Houthi strikes have been incredibly successful, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said. Last time I was at this podium, there were more than 100 successful strikes. There have now been over 200 successful strikes. Iran is incredibly weakened as a result of these attacks. On March 15th, President Donald Trump announced that he would restart President Biden's bombing campaign in Yemen at an accelerated pace. In January 2024, Biden ordered his Pentagon to attack the Houthis after the group closed the Red Sea. Obviously, then we know what happened with the whole group chat situation, but well over 25 civilians were killed in that first week of bombing, and the number has climbed up. I don't know if it's over 100 yet, but I believe nearly 100 civilians have perished in these fairly indiscriminate strikes across Yemen. But again, the Yemenis have a very similar setup to, Hezbollah, to Iran itself. And there have even been reports that the U.S. bunker buster strikes on the Houthis are sort of a dry run, a preparation for the strikes on Iran's deep underground military bases, as well as their deep underground nuclear facilities that are built into mountains and other such realities. But to head on over to the situation with Azerbaijan, this is from the Hudson Institute. This is one of the most interesting things that came out this week, at least for World War Now analysis purposes. And it says, the West needs Azerbaijan to contain Russia and Iran. Azerbaijan is strategically important to the West. It is the only country in the world that borders both Russia and Iran, and it has successfully resisted dominance by both. Without a strong and independent Azerbaijan, there will be no middle corridor, the only land route from Central Asia to Europe that is not controlled by either Moscow or Tehran. There would be no southern gas corridor, the US-backed initiative that supplies gas to America's NATO allies. Azerbaijan is containing Russian expansionism, containing Iranian aggression, and providing Europe with energy security. And this was the Hudson Institute writing in the Wall Street Journal. The Hudson Institute, very much a neoconservative think tank, that went on to say, the Hudson Institute announced it met with senior Israeli officials in Jerusalem. During the meeting, Israeli officials praised Azerbaijan's crucial support during Israel's war against Hamas. Israeli officials also told the Hudson Institute that the Azerbaijani Jewish community is safer and better integrated into society than Jews in most European countries. So, here on World War Now, for years we have been discussing, Azerbaijan as a sort of Jewish golem state. And they say, what does the quote say? It says that Azerbaijan is containing Russian expansionism. What does that mean? Presumably that means destroying Armenia in their regional war, and then basically forcing, Armenia. Pashinyan, I believe, recently signed some sort of accession into the European Union. So Armenia has been fully integrated into the West at this point. Russian peacekeepers, withdrew from the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. I assume that's what they're talking about there. Containing Iranian aggression, obviously, that involves both Azerbaijan's extensive support for Israel on top of, I'm sure we know, Azerbaijani intelligence, frequently informs on Iran. And who knows, maybe it could even be a reference to covert Azerbaijani involvement in the death of former Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, and of course providing Europe with energy security. As we said, this is why we have to be so skeptical of, Turkey is big and evil. Obviously, yes, Erdogan is viewed as a sort of wild card. People don't trust him. He's considered a dictator within the mold of, Putin and the Ayatollah and these other characters. But look, if Azerbaijan is considered this critical Western ally, that they literally mentioned that there would be no middle corridor. They're talking about this belt that, ostensibly would split, the multipolar Middle East from, of course, Russia. And the key to that is this Turkish belt that connects Turkey and Azerbaijan, then gets over into these other Turkish places. But, with Armenia always having been considered a Russian satellite, that's why that was considered one of the big disruptors to this, pro-Western corridor. So that's why I think there will be increased Israeli and Western pressure on these protests and on this attempt to overthrow Erdogan, because if Erdogan goes, the situation is set up perfectly. Azerbaijan is already in the Israeli camp. A new Kemalist Turkey would, accede to U.S. demands, and then Iran and Russia would be free to be confronted directly, which, again, who knows exactly how soon any of these things are going to occur. We know the Iranian strikes and the fall of Erdogan, I believe that they're going to happen very close to one another. But again, everything we've talked about so far in the episode is very much related, and I'm grateful for the Hudson Institute for just coming out and saying it, because I hope the Russians are reading this, because they need to realize that Azerbaijan is not a friend.
No, absolutely. I think in the long term, the Russians do have economic aspirations. For example, the most peaceful economic relations Russia can have that will never impact any of the countries that relate to one another through sovereignty and any sort of other relation would, of course, be the South-North axis, right? Because when you speak about Russian relations with China, there are always concerns about Russian sovereignty, who controls the Siberian lands, who trades, population density, etc. When Russia deals with the West, of course, there's other cultural issues involved. But the one relationship Russia can have theoretically in the long term, which will not impact basically anything, and it almost has a clear history of almost no conflict, would of course be the Russia South-North axis with trading with India, Pakistan, Iran, Azerbaijan. But Azerbaijan needs to play a part in this because it is that crucial chain. It is, of course, one of the main hubs of oil, gas in the Caspian Sea. Azerbaijan needs to participate as a partner because a lot of Russians economically are speaking about, well, in the future, how do we build a long-standing relationship with India, with Iran? Azerbaijan needs to partake in that. And Azerbaijan clearly now has selected a path of some sort of liberal Western integration, despite the fact that it's very centrally positioned in the Middle East. It's, even more Middle Eastern than Israel, frankly. So, yeah, there's a lot of discourse. I think Russians are theory crafting this, some sort of future way of getting out of the economic rut that the world is in right now. But Azerbaijan is, again, it's almost like a splinter and a log in the eye of those analysts, because no one can really understand what kind of role Azerbaijan will play in the future of the region. I think it'll play, frankly, a Gog and Magog type scenario. I think Azerbaijan very much is a land which will be involved heavily in the apocalyptic future. So unfortunately, I think, especially with its relationship to Armenia, there's the news coming out of Azerbaijan in the near future, I think, will not be very positive, Conrad. That's just my reckoning. I think not just this relationship with Israel, but also with Turkey. I think we'll have a lot more news sort of going forward. This is why we discussed Baku and Azerbaijan, Aliyev, with such detail, because it's essentially somewhat predictive of the future. But very interesting updates from the Russian-Ukrainian war front, actually, just traveling north over the Black Sea. In particular, I guess we'll begin in the naval arena. There's been over 107 drones shot down over the Sea of Azov. So there's Ukrainian drones flying over the SMO zone, trying to get at the Kursk bridge, trying to get at some of the Rostov-on-Don energy facilities. Ukrainians are actively seeking to essentially prevent any sort of Russian peace by flying literal drone swarms across Russian territories. By the way, these drones are flying over military targets in order to strike at essentially what we can call energy targets, civilian targets. Now, frankly, Ukraine is using the excuse that, well, these energy facilities, these oil refinery factories, etc., they're being used to fuel the war machine of the Russian army, so they need to be targeted. But we have very clear people who have literally no security clearance, no relation to the military working at these facilities. There are typically villages and towns surrounding these areas, similar to Pripyat in Chernobyl, for example. That's a clear example. Ukraine targeting some of these very key areas will, of course, hurt innocent people. And we have had innocent people recently die in the Bryansk region. And Ukrainian drones, like furthermore, when we discuss the drone issue, we always have Ukrainian drones hitting seemingly civilian targets amidst, Russian air defense firing at them. The drones essentially are choosing targets which are much closer to the ground, much easier to hit. And so a few homes were hit and damaged in the Moscow region. I don't believe there are any casualties at the moment, but if you can imagine Ukrainian drones already reaching Moscow, it's almost on a bi-weekly basis at this point. It almost feels like none of the Russian Western territories are safe, frankly. In order to be safe in Russia at the moment, safe from the current Russo-Ukrainian war, you literally need to be east of the Ural Mountains and literally central Russia or in Siberia. It's quite dangerous. In Bryansk, there's been at least one person killed, a few more injured from these drone attacks. Lots of drone interceptions taking place everywhere, but the Russians are not sitting still and just taking it. They're, of course, firing back. Dnipropetrovsk, the Dnipro, the main city of Ukrainian Jewry, for example, as they call it, the secret capital of Ukraine, with the Menorah Center next to the Rose Synagogue position there. This is where Zelensky's main funders especially come from, Igor Kolomoisky, etc. This is probably where, in the tunnels below the city, unseemingly dark things are taking place, right? And this is the one town which Russia has essentially not bombed. But this is the one place which, we admit the toilet and the factory outside of Dnipro was bombed by the Ereshnik last year in October. We do recall that. We can't, keep that away from Russia. It is a great achievement showing these sort of very futuristic space-style lasers and weapons that Russia has displayed for us. And, we have to give kudos where it's due. But Dnipropetrovsk airport has been hit by Russian airstrikes. I think it was the Russian, probably Sukhoi planes or MiGs that flew in and fired some long-range bombs at the Dnipro airport, essentially trying to... It's fascinating that these airports are still operational, Conrad. I think that's somewhat surprising. But the Russians essentially are fearing some sort of launches of Ukrainian F-16s or some helicopters, potentially military targets. They're not striking civilian aircraft by any stretch. I think that's what we're kind of seeing from the front lines. Russians are trying to also progress on the front line from these various directions. The infamous city of Ugledar, where Russians have suffered one of the worst defeats of previous years, Russians have suffered another unfortunate. They tried to breach a village of Alexeyevka, and the Russian column of tanks and other heavy trucks were stopped dead in their tracks as they moved through the village by Ukrainian long-range artillery. So it's still that combination that we see on the front line. So you have drones essentially smashing into these trucks and tanks at high speeds, or at least distracting them. And as the tanks and the trucks slow down in their columns, you have Ukrainian artillery positioning themselves, taking aim and firing at them. So it's this combination of strikes which really we don't see this anywhere else in the world, because frankly, nowhere else do we see a war with such high-grade technology being used in these sort of interesting, futuristic 21st century tactics. Not even the Gulf War in the US had this sort of weaponry and a combination of drone warfare and artillery being used at such little expense, frankly, because the drones are so cheap. They're over like $1,000, $2,000 American dollars each. You can just sort of throw them at these tanks, which are worth significantly more. So it's quite interesting. And again, when discussing Air Force and Ukrainians using these new F-16 planes, we do know that NATO has announced that they're delivering a new entire package of F-16s to Ukraine. It's not clear what number of F-16s there will be that they'll provide to Ukraine, but we know that there will be at least probably 10 plus. And of course, Ukraine already has an entire cohort of F-16 pilots. I just want to preface before we discuss the entirety of the front of Ukraine that there's a lot of fake news taking place online, especially from seemingly patriotic Russian sources, maybe right-wing pro-Z bloggers who are essentially stating that the Ukrainians are surrendering en masse, Ukrainians are giving up. That's not the case. The front line, for all intents and purposes, especially the right-wing Russians, conservatives, are passing on that Ukrainians are fighting very, very stubbornly on almost every front. In Pokrovsk, for example, that the Russians are trying to surrender. Finally, the Russians have taken the village of Shevchenko, but only after fighting for that one little village for 3 weeks. We talked about how this village literally swapped hands at least 5 to 10 times, if you can imagine. So that's Ukrainians take the village, Russians take the village, Ukrainians take the village, Russians take the village. The amount of bloodshed happening is absolutely insane. And this village is only one piece of the puzzle. In order to actually surround Pokrovsk, you need to take this village and many others, which, of course, in order to make the full surround from the western side and the eastern side. And Ukrainians are continuing to throw their forces at the Russians. So Pokrovsk is far from being surrounded. In fact, you still have fighting in villages of Kotlino. Of course, Russians are holding Shevchenko, Peshchane, Zverevo, Uspenkovo. There's still a lot of fighting taking place around Pokrovsk, and it looks like we said initially a few months ago that, we're maybe weeks away from a full surround. That prediction, I think, has fallen through because the Ukrainians are very stubbornly just pushing back and preventing the Pokrovsk run. It is turning into the new Bakhmut, the new Avdiivka, unfortunately, and that only means that more Slavs will be dying on the front lines of this particular conflict. So, and moving on to probably the most famous front in recent months, we've had some huge developments in the Sumskaya Oblast. The Russians have been pushing in, trying to secure certain villages, basically turning them into defensive positions on Ukrainian territories. This, of course, will play a large part in any sort of wartime, peacetime negotiations, which we'll discuss next, with Marco Rubio essentially complaining, stating that, he predicts it'll take a few weeks to actually ascertain the position of Russia in relation to future peace talks. So already you see the US cabinet essentially giving up its predictions of a quick peaceful deal, a quick ceasefire for like a month or two. It's looking like there won't be a peace deal until well after Easter, perhaps even after the 9th of May, that huge parade that Russia is planning on the 80th anniversary of the completion of the Great Patriotic War, World War II in Moscow. So it'll be a very interesting time, I think, to witness all the world leaders gather in Moscow. Essentially, from what we see, there'll be probably a lot of air defense activated in the Moskovskaya Oblast, because we do have a lot of the Ukrainian drones flying at that area, and it's incredibly unsafe, I would say. But in right next door to Sumskaya Oblast, we have huge progress by the Russians in Kursk, and it'll be very interesting to see the footage, because Ukrainians are actually in Kursk. They're holding the Guiva area and the Gornal area, just south, essentially, where Kurskaya Oblast meets Sumskaya Oblast. But what's interesting is the Gornal area has a very old Russian monastery. It's a few hundred years old, the St. Nicholas Monastery. This is one of the churches in this monastery was bombed very heavily when the Ukrainians first entered into Sudzha and into the Kursk Oblast. We will recall footage. I think the monastery, it's white with like light blue domes. It was very clearly visible. You can see the artillery markings. Ukrainians essentially just shot at the monastery itself. But it seems like once the Russians take this monastery, I'll be very curious to see what exactly has taken place in Gornal, how the Ukrainians respected the Russian churches, how they respected the monastery grounds, or have they simply used them as these weird storage facilities, or even, God forbid, what kind of desecration will the Russians uncover there? So Ukrainians are still holding Gornal and Guiva in Kursk, and the Russians are pushing back at them. Fortunately enough, in Bryansk, the Russians have been holding that back, holding the Ukrainians, not letting them enter any further in. And I think the Ukrainians, of course, haven't moved very deeply into the Belgorodskaya Oblast, and we're, of course, very thankful for that, because the last thing we need is for this conflict to be exacerbated, for more war crimes to be committed, more villages captured, more, of course, villagers literally taken to concentration camps, and, of course, Russian conscripts who have been holding these borders. Look, there's a lot of questioning as to why you have the young 18, 19, 20-year-old Russians with almost no military experience holding these borders against trained Ukrainian commandos as they enter in, and they, of course, take them prisoner. Of course, most likely this is because Russia simply does not have the personnel at the moment on the front lines. And this is one of the main criticisms Strelkov has been putting out there for a while. Recently, Maxim Kalashnikov released a really big video. He's a big military analyst in Russia, on Roy TV, his YouTube channel, where he criticized the Russian government for not establishing at least even a war plan of how to mobilize more troops, because Russia at the moment is suffering from a lack of troops to hold this lengthy border that it has established in the SMO zone, and there's no real peace talks really coming up, and the border has only expanded. Like at the beginning of the war, Bryansk wasn't really a front. Belgorod didn't need defending. Now it's clear that you have 2,000 plus kilometers 1,500 miles roughly of land that needs to be covered by not just active reinforcements and troops, but also border guards. And Russia simply does not have that many personnel recruited at the moment actually fighting. And mobilization comes with its own challenges. Economically speaking, you're literally taking people out of the workforce. And there's, of course, all kinds of social strife. The Russian economy isn't doing all too well, as certainly some conservative people in various other podcasts will tell you. That they say Russia is, of course, doing very well economically. It isn't. Of course, Russians are still suffering not only from the war, but from the lengthy sanctions. And of course, it's a long list of issues that's taking place there on the ground. So the Russians, again, are holding out in terms of morale, but how long can this particular situation last? I think that's one of the main questions. And so I think as soon as Kursk is taken, hopefully by the 9th of May, the entirety of the Kursk Oblast reestablished, the Russians could again breathe maybe some air of relief that finally all of Russia is whole again. Of course, the Ukrainians pushed out of Belgorod, and now finally a new sort of offensive can commence. Maybe every year, Conrad, we've been predicting that the 9th of May, there'll be some sort of announcement, a new mobilization, an SMO Part 2. Our predictions have always been somewhat off because, frankly, the 9th of May so far hasn't really been a parade of victory. It's just been this sort of historical event where Russia has announced that, look, we are effectively fighting the neo-Nazis, the Banderites on the front lines, and we're just doing our job. But there's no real analysis, there's no real assessment of exactly what's happening on the front. Russia, I think, is always fighting this war of attrition and has been for the last few years, and it does seem like it will need some further successes, such as the taking of Pokrovsk, maybe the return of Izum, Kupiansk, etc., before anything really can be announced and proclaimed that Russia is victorious. We know the Russian politicians are very two-faced about announcing objectives being met, as we saw in Syria when, unfortunately, Vladimir Putin mentioned very clearly that he stated that the Syrian objectives have been met and Russia is victorious in its Syrian campaign, which is, I think, borderline hypocritical, maybe a little bit untrue. So it'll be interesting to see how the situation develops further. But the good news is there's a lot of really great interviews. There's almost even, you can call it maybe a documentary film. It's like a 1 hour, really lengthy YouTube video released from Sudzha describing the Russian operation of taking Sudzha through those gas pipelines. Very interesting. Unfortunately, I don't know if it has English subtitles, but the video has a really good interview of Father Alexei, one of the military priests who his son was actually in the Sudzha pipes himself. Of Father Alexei, as well as some other military priests, were actually in the pipes traveling to Sudzha in order to surround the Ukrainian forces and essentially, come out of those pipes alongside hundreds of other Russian infantrymen. There's been a lot more information about that, really secretive, and you can almost call it like a black ops type operation, which the Russians successfully held. It does appear that it wasn't just the Russian Spetsnaz or Akhmat, for example, some special forces which the Russians used. It was essentially just the regular infantry. The majority of the forces of the Russians that came out of those pipes in Sudzha were just regular infantry guys. They weren't some sort of special operations troops, which is very admirable. And I think the priests really confirmed that when they stated, well, look, our children, they just serve in like a regular Russian infantry detachments. They're not, special by any stretch of the imagination. They're just very courageous Russian Orthodox troops. And it's quite heartwarming sort of seeing those interviews and seeing those reports. The Russians on the ground in Kursk are very high in morale at the moment. All the videos show them smiling. They're all very happy that they took Sudzha. So it's a huge victory, I think. And only now, literally weeks later, can we see the aftermath and just the positive effect it's had on the Russian people on the front line. So at least there's some positive news from that particular angle.
No, that was a good frontline update. Patrick Lancaster, of course, has been talking about Ukraine desperately trying to increase their incursion into the Belgorod region, but I think the Russians are going to do everything they can to prevent that from happening. Of course, you mentioned Marco Rubio. He made some recent remarks. He said, speaking to reporters at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Marco Rubio said, what we're not interested in, and I'm not accusing them of this, I'm just telling you, what we're not interested in is negotiations about negotiations, that we're not going to continue this forever. He continued, I think it was more an explanation of, this is our timeline, and at some point it will be clear whether you want peace or you don't want peace, and that time is coming. It's pretty short. While Rubio said the U.S. position wasn't threatening, he went on to say that Congress could add new sanctions on Russia if Moscow is perceived not to be advancing towards talks with Kiev quickly enough. Members of Congress have begun to file bills to increase sanctions, he added. So there is going to be growing pressure from Capitol Hill to impose sanctions that we're not going to be able to stop if, in fact, we're not making progress towards peace. The top diplomat said the message has been made clear to Moscow that we need to begin to see real progress, or we'll have to conclude that they're not interested in peace. Rubio said that the message was relayed through Kirill Dmitriev, CEO of Russia's Direct Investment Fund, the Russian government's sovereign wealth fund, who was in the U.S. for talks with President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff this week. While Rubio said Washington would know within weeks, not months, if Moscow wanted to make a deal, Reuters reported on Thursday that the Trump administration will be unable to secure a Ukraine peace deal in the next few months and are drawing up new plans to pressure both Kiev and Moscow. The Kremlin also says the two sides are far apart on reaching a deal. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said on Tuesday that Russia couldn't accept U.S. proposals on ending the Ukraine war. U.S. officials noted that President Trump was increasingly faulted with Russian President Putin for delaying talks after initially placing blame on Ukrainian President Zelensky. On Sunday, Trump said he was pissed off at Putin and threatened to place secondary tariffs on Russia. So this on top of these reports, and this stuff is being republished in the Kiev Independent. This headline is from HNGN. So I'm not saying this is 100% accurate, but I think it is directionally true. The headline is Russia to deploy 150,000 more troops in Ukraine as frontline tensions escalate. In a significant escalation of its military presence, Russia plans to bolster its forces in Ukraine by an additional 150,000 soldiers in 2025, roughly the size of 15 motorized infantry divisions, according to Pavlo Palisa, the deputy head of Ukraine's presidential office. So again, this is from Ukraine. Obviously, they want the U.S. to think that Russia is about to sweep in there so they can continue to get weapons. But at the same time, if Russia did want to continue its operations, which they obviously are in all directions, of course, they're going to have to, substitute their losses and, continue to bolster these areas with, again, 150,000 is good. But I think if they're to achieve the goals that they seem to want to achieve as they balk at negotiations, I think they're going to have to increase the number beyond that. But if you have any thoughts on a potential future Russian offensive, Dimitri, I'd love to hear it. And then I will get right into Trump's tariffs.
Oh, no, absolutely. I think that's 150, remember, is only half of the troops that were mobilized in late 2022 after, of course, the famous retreat of Russians from Kherson, from Izum, etc., the first mobilization that took place in Russia. So it's not a very large number. Yeah, frankly, it does seem like a lot, but we have to remember at the moment, Ukraine has more, if not equal on parity with Russia of troops on the front line, roughly between 600 and 700,000, which these are huge numbers, but these are also personnel who are working on tech, fixing tanks, of course, providing food supplies, etc. It's not just literal manpower on the ground. And by the way, remember we spoke about early in January this year how the clashes on the front lines have reduced below, I think it was 100 skirmishes or clashes per day. They've actually increased now to 200 again. So it's roughly 200 to 250 fighting points between Russian and Ukrainian troops across the entire front line, which is quite significant. That means there's definitely a lot of fighting. The war has again reached this point of hot confrontation between the two sides. So I think it's hopefully the Ukrainian news is actually true and Russia is going to bolster their frontline troops. But again, I'm somewhat doubtful because from all the news I've been hearing from Russia, there isn't any of this rhetoric of actually moving more troops to the front line. If anything, the Russian paid media on Channel 1, for example, are just not pushing the narrative of mobilization. They're simply stating that Russia is actually achieving victory with the forces that it already has. And I think that's quite questionable. Just one thing I want to mention before we discuss the tariffs, Conrad, because this is somewhat maybe a branching subject. The man, Kirill Dmitriev, a very interesting character because he's the one who's speaking to Witkoff right now, is in the US, he's in Washington. Witkoff, as we know, is an Ashkenazi Jew. His real estate agent is essentially a billionaire, if I'm not mistaken, a wealthy businessman at the very least. Dmitriev himself is a very mysterious character. He's quite young man, 49 years of age, a lot younger than Putin. He seems to have been appointed as he's essentially the president of the Foreign Investment and Economic Corporation Fund in Russia. So he's an economic guy. He's essentially a banker by profession. In fact, he's worked at Goldman Sachs. This is where he began his career. And Goldman Sachs, as we know, made by, essentially founded by Marcus Goldman, an Ashkenazi Jewish banker, one of the greatest American banks, unfortunately, very Jewish in nature. He's worked essentially with Jewish bankers his entire career across Europe, not just in America. He knows American culture. He's studied at Stanford University. This is probably one of the reasons why Putin sent this man, Dmitriev, this mysterious economist, to the US, because he knows American culture. He knows how Americans speak there, he knows the vibes of the area. He knows how to speak to these elite people in Washington, and potentially Putin needs someone to discuss, maybe broach some sort of deals behind the scenes. Notice he doesn't work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. He doesn't work for Lavrov. He doesn't work for Ushakov or any of these other figures. It's almost like Russia has two ministries of foreign affairs. It's very bizarre because it's almost like Lavrov can position himself as this anti-American Brixian, this sort of, not, how do I say third worldist, but, he's a figure of multipolarity, whilst Dmitriev, this sort of educated, man who's worked with the economic financial jury around the world, he's Putin's own personal his own figure that Putin can move to discuss to discuss things with the adults behind the scenes. It's a very interesting dynamic. By the way, even the Russians are not sure. By Russians, I mean the Russian analysts, the conservative people who I follow. They're not really familiar with Dmitriev and who this particular guy is. He's very mysterious, and it does seem like he's almost like a second Lavrov. If Lavrov is a figurehead for the BRICS and for the Eurasian type of folks, Dmitriev is almost like Russia's spokesperson, at least for the West, for the Western side, for the financial elites, for the globalists. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of discussions he can broach in Washington and what kind of assistance he can provide Russia. Hopefully it'll be positive, but we just have to keep in mind he is Putin's guy. And it seems like Putin doesn't want Lavrov to be traveling to Washington because Lavrov really has turned himself into this figure of anti-Americanism across the world. And I think he really can't lose that status. So Putin's like, all right, we're going to have a second guy play this role, someone who maybe the world is less familiar with. So very interesting figure indeed.
Yes, and I think one of the big turning points here in foreign relations, not just between Russia and the US, because of course sanctions, tariffs, economic, currency restrictions have been going back and forth between Russia and the US since, of course, 2022. The big story this week domestically, of course, was Liberation Day, as it's being called, Donald Trump's massive new tariff policy, which up until now, again, Trump had been leveraging 25% tariffs, 15% tariffs, huge tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And what a lot of people were saying, oh, this is just brinksmanship. He's trying to make a deal. It's just, these are retaliatory. These aren't going to be forever. But Trump, to the joy of a lot of protectionists, a lot of America First people, people that like Pat Buchanan and have read his books on, why free trade isn't actually the quote unquote conservative or nationalist position. People are very excited, not just because of the huge reciprocal tariffs Trump has placed on countries that have large tariffs on the United States, but across the board, there was a 10% tariff put on all imports that affects every single country, including, I think it was like the Head Islands and some of these other places that are solely occupied by penguins. People with the headlines like Trump put a 10% tariff on them as well. So, those penguins are going to have to, make some adjustments to their export policies. But just to give a few highlights, I'm going through the whole list right now. Again, most countries are hit with the baseline 10%. Then you have certain examples of countries, like Algeria, for example, which on its own end charges the 59% tariff on U.S. imports. The U.S. therefore hit them with a 30% tariff. Bosnia and Herzegovina got hit with a 35% tariff, despite the fact that they charge the U.S. a 70% tariff. So these aren't even fully reciprocal. Botswana, 37%, despite charging, the U.S. 74%. Of course, some of the big ones, of course, Cambodia, 49%. Cambodia is a big exporter. China, of course, has been hit with a 34% tariff. A lot of other places, Guyana, some of these places that in theory export a lot of natural resources even have been hit with tariffs, a 39% tariff on Iraq, a 24% tariff on Japan, a 48% tariff on Laos. Again, these Southeast Asian countries are big production powerhouses. 31% tariff on our friends in Moldova, brutal. We have Myanmar hit with a 44% tariff, but they were already hitting the U.S. with an 88% tariff. And of course, Myanmar and the junta are not on good terms with the United States. Pakistan got hit with a 29% tariff. And again, even Russia, people were very offended that a country, Ukraine, for example, was hit with the 10% baseline tariff, as was Russia. So Russia and Ukraine have been, treated equally in this regard, as opposed to, some of these other countries that got, much larger. I mean, Vietnam with a 46% tariff. Vietnam is one of the biggest exporters to the United States. Even my home country of the Turks and Caicos Islands, they got hit with a 10% tariff. I'm not sure how much exporting to the United States Turks and Caicos is doing, as all their food comes from the United States. But I thought that was funny. Turkey, they got hit with the baseline 10%. So nothing too dramatic there. But yeah, I mean, between Japan, China, Vietnam, these are some of the biggest exporters of goods to the United States that are going to be hit with this. Supposedly $7 trillion in monetary assets in the stock market have been liquidated. We're seeing huge gains, obviously, in the crypto spheres. So I'm no economic expert. I'm not, somebody that could break down to you exactly the mechanics of why this is going to help. I couldn't necessarily take on the biggest free trade advocate in a debate per se, but I do know that I trust Pat Buchanan, and he, a long time ago, convinced me that, protectionism and free trade is the conservative nationalist position. For those that don't know, the second bill that President George Washington signed was the Tariff Act of 1789. And again, despite the fact that, conservatives from a somewhat libertarian perspective extol and exhort the virtues of free trade, at the end of the day, when you have a trade deficit with some of these countries, all that means is you're selling out your country to that country. They take the profit that they make from the trade deficit and reinvest it in US bonds and these other things. Or in the case of China, they'll buy United States land, they will buy corporations, all these sorts of things. And of course, in the case of India and China, there are enough immigrants in this country that those newly bought corporations by foreign entities would very much benefit from employing these new arrivals, these Indians and these Chinese, these Asians, as opposed to employing Americans. Whereas, look, I understand that, made in America now likely, unfortunately, means made by, non-white immigrants because of the demographic change of the past 20 years. We still need to start actually bringing manufacturing back to this country and making sure that people can actually have, real jobs, that the middle class can have real jobs. And I think obviously all of the hand-wringing against the tariffs are coming from those that are sort of the financiers of our current system. The only industries that benefit from a country like the United States having a trade deficit are, the finance sector, those that hold and own large swaths of real estate, and of course the insurance sector that involves insuring all of these finances and all of this real estate. Everybody else that has normal productive jobs, they very much get hurt and economically raped in the long run. So I applaud Trump for keeping his promise on America First trade. And I think, again, the big consequence as well will be how this gets leveraged geopolitically. People are waiting to see. Obviously, the 10% baseline tariff seems to show that Trump is playing for keeps on an actual economic industrial policy. Of course, he's going to have to come out with some subsidies to help grow some industry. But the other question is, well, some of these bigger tariffs placed on these other countries, especially places like China, even some of our allies, is that going to lead to negotiations? And will the fact that Russia didn't get hit with anything that dramatic, is the U.S. showing goodwill? I think these are the questions that are going to be answered in the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, I think China has already announced that it will be imposing its own additional tariffs on the US starting from the 10th of April. So in fact, we will see retaliation tariffs. And that's one of the main fears that a lot of economists are putting out there. And in particular, we'll speak about how this will, in the long term, potentially impact geopolitics and some of these world affairs, and how it may even lead the world into further economic escalation. And I would say, geopolitically speaking, may lead the world further into this drawn out conflict, which we're discussing on this podcast. Because frankly, if the trade slows down around the world because of the tariffs, imports, exports slow down, the oil price has already dropped by 6 to 7%. We will see a more negative outlook between countries, in particular China. If China retaliates, places a very high tariff on, because again, the US tariff China with 34%, I believe, it will be very significant on the US-Chinese relationship. And why does that matter, I suppose, in relation to Russia, Ukraine, to Taiwan? Clearly it does matter because the US, Trump has already proposed his potential most hardcore sanction that it can place on Russia. It's not even tariff-based. It'll be based on sanctioning countries which deal with Russia in terms of gas and oil, which is, of course, China, India, a lot of these BRICS nations, which also trade heavily with the US, even you would say more so than they trade with the Russian Federation. If Russia does not cooperate with Trump in producing a long-standing or even a short-standing peace with the Ukrainians, Trump may threaten Russia with these really hardcore sanctions that have been placed on Iran decades ago. And what these sanctions will essentially do is that if any country trades with Russia in any way whatsoever, the country trading with Russia will be sanctioned, not Russia itself. And so these countries will turn away from the Russian Federation in order to keep their positive relations with the US. The likelihood, however, is that, of course, if the Chinese-US relationship is already severed and negatively affected, of course, China will only seek to breach that deficit, and perhaps with the US, its main trade partner in the world, not the Russian Federation. So China will be more likely to, of course, adhere to any of Trump's these pursuits of, again, putting pressure on Russia geopolitically, economically. Hopefully that won't happen. It's a very long-term scenario, but generally speaking, I think this is kind of what Trump is aiming for. And he's also showing some spine, as I mentioned prior. He's showing that he actually does have the realpolitik approach to the economy, to geopolitics, not just to Greenland. He's not just about big talk. He can actually shake up. And as you said, Conrad, he can make trillions of dollars move around the world. He's willing to do that. He's showing that in every issue, unless it's Israel, Trump is willing to make very strong moves. And I think that's somewhat admirable. It's at least impressive that, protectionism is one of the best things I think the US can do in order to, again, maybe try to revive its industrial capacity. That's one of the main considerations. When the Russian Empire, for example, was trying to really move industrialization in the 1880s and the 1890s, it imposed very high tariffs on the German Empire. I think it was between 80 and 90% on German industry because it wanted to protect the young Russian industrial base from German imports. So tariffs are very normal. Countries have been imposing them throughout the 19th, 20th century. However, we're just not sure in this particular geopolitical landscape how exactly they will affect relations between countries. And they may put countries like China in a very hard place. But the other big consideration is the fact that it seems like countries, the Gulf states, for example, some of these other oil-producing nations, Conrad, they're trying to make up for the deficit. And how they're doing that is they're selling more oil. They're unlocking the oil valves, they're loosening them. More oil is being supplied to the world. And so, of course, as there's more supply, therefore the demand reduces. And so, of course, the price of oil is going down. It's already plunged by 7%, I believe, as of this Friday, so the 4th of April. It will probably drop even further. And this, of course, directly impacts America's main geopolitical enemies, that is the Russian Federation and Iran, because these two countries depend on oil imports to some of their neighbors, and Russia in particular is heavily affected. If the price of gas also falls, this will, of course, even further deepen Russia's already economically complicated situation. So in some ways, this is you can almost say a geopolitical move as much as it is economic. He's, of course, negatively affecting some of America's potential geopolitical enemies around the world. So it's not a dumb policy as a lot of the liberal politicians are proclaiming. I think there's clearly all the Russian economists, by the way, at the moment, all the most base right-wing Russian economists, starting with Sergei Glaziev, for example, who's literally worked for the Russian government, they're all very much bullish on tariffs and protectionism. They believe Russia, in fact, should also begin imposing tariffs on countries. Russia's not really in an economic powerhouse type position, but for Russia to redevelop its industry that it lost in the 1990s and even during the Russian Revolution, it really needs to start again taking on this more protectionist approach. So maybe Trump is opening up this new era of literally a return to normalcy in some way. So I can't negatively approach this sort of tariff move by the US, but we can clearly see how this may link itself to further geopolitical escalations around the world. So it's definitely not just economic. This will affect literally the fighting happening on the front lines in the Middle East. And God forbid, if there is a war with Iran later this year, how will that affect the fossil fuel, the energy market? I mean, there'll be a lot of economic strife going forward. It won't just be nuclear waste and literally bombs flying that we'll have to worry about. It's literally how to sustain our families, etc. So there's a lot of really complicated times coming up.
Yeah, Metropolitan Neophytos openly in a lot of his talks about the prophecies in World War III says that, again, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's not going to be any fuel and you're going to need to retain a donkey to get anywhere. So that very much ties into all of this energy tariff-related stuff that is very much coming down the pike here. But we have to move on to Europe, of course. Big news, specifically from France. This is from the AP, of course. Those that don't know, Marine Le Pen was arrested, charged, and is being barred from running in the 2027 presidential election in France. AP says the 56-year-old daughter of the late far-right totemic figure Jean-Marie Le Pen was sentenced to 2 years under house arrest while wearing an electronic ankle bracelet and an additional 2-year suspended sentence and 5 years ineligibility for public office with immediate effect. Le Pen's lawyer said she would appeal the verdict, but she will remain ineligible while she does, and so could be ruled out of the 2027 presidential race. Le Pen won't serve the house arrest sentence until all appeals are exhausted, but the ban on running for office will be implemented immediately despite her legal challenge. With the election just 2 years away, time is running out, and there's no guarantee that an appeals court would rule more favorably. Le Pen and other National Rally Party officials stood trial for having used money intended for European Union parliamentary aids instead to pay staff who worked for the party between 2004 and 2016, violating the 27 nation bloc's regulations. The National Rally was called the National Front at the time. The judge said Le Pen had been at the heart of a system that her party used to siphon off EU Parliament money. Le Pen, who denied wrongdoing, was also fined 100,000 euros. So this is huge news. Obviously, this is another Georgescu type episode. Another, much like what we're seeing in Germany as well, where the AfD is being limited. The Russians even had comments about how Europe is violating democratic norms. Peskov talked about this. And again, from the Russians, it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek kind of, haha, look, we now have the opportunity to condemn you for violating democracy. Obviously we all know Russia isn't really a democracy either, so it's a bit funny, but it's true. I mean, Europe, you can't even make the argument right now that Europe is somehow democratic, that it's somehow super pluralistic. They are openly rigging, quote unquote democracy to make sure that liberal globalism is the only option and the only game in town. And of course, people are wondering who's going to run against Macron for president now. Of course, Jordan Bardella is sort of the obvious frontrunner. He is the other leader of the party. I believe he is one of the prime ministers or whatever the role in the French parliament is, where multiple party heads sort of share this leadership. He is that one right now. And he is, as far as I can tell, even less based than Le Pen, more philo-Semitic, and clearly less persecuted by the establishment. So we definitely don't want him. However, I'm not even too sympathetic to Le Pen anyway. She disavowed the AfD. She very much waffled on a lot of issues. So it's unfortunate to see all of this. However, in 2027, there will be a very likely chance that the right defeats the left and the center left in the election. So obviously we want to make sure that they have somebody that is respectable. And I think we can get somebody that's slightly less Jewed up than Bardella. That would be great. But again, Le Pen, she ran twice against Macron. She lost both times. I had said in the past that it's probably time for some new blood, but Bardella is not exactly what we need. He's very young and charismatic, so I was, somewhat encouraged back in the day, but he has very much proven himself to be on the Israeli payroll. So, that's what's going on there. And speaking of Israel, it's all June news from Europe these days, with Hungary welcoming Netanyahu to Budapest. Netanyahu and Orban gave speeches side by side while Orban said that he would be withdrawing Hungary from the International Criminal Court. We're going to talk about the new Hungarian-Serbian military alliance in a second. But again, all of these, right-wing forces that ostensibly would ally with a Trump White House, even Serbia with Vucic, obviously Hungary with Orban, Georgescu in Romania, who again, he's not in power right now, but he was representing a sort of similar interest group. Obviously, Fico in Slovakia, the right wing in France, are all very Zionist, very pro-Israel, specifically pro-Likud, pro-Netanyahu. There's sort of this understanding that this national populist right-wing network is very much boosted by Likud. We know Yoram Hazony of the National Conservatism Conference. He's very much involved in all these European right-wing governments. And they, it got to the point where, Orban is talking about how Hungarian Jews are the safest Jews in Europe. And we're thinking Hungary and Azerbaijan. Who's taking care of their Jews the best? It's a new competition that is unveiling for who can, dance the dreidel dance for Netanyahu enough. But obviously, the fact that Trump and America are very supportive of these right-wing movements and their, relations with Israel show that there's sort of a dialectic being presented. And obviously, Russia, breaks with these groups on Israel a little bit more than the right-wing groups themselves. You, of course, have the AfD in Germany with the, its more far-right faction, which is about half of the party. They, I think, are at least skeptical or neutral on the Israel-Palestine question because, deep down, those people know the score with World War II and, Israel and all those sorts of things. And they recognize that, to have any kind of self-respect, they can't continue to be slaves to the Zionists and the Jews because, ever since, the end of the Reich, that's very much what they were, with all the occupations from the Allies, as well as the reparations they've been forced to pay Israel and the Jews because of propagandized atrocities. So, that's what's going on in Europe. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on Le Pen, as well as the Hungary situation on top of these new military alliances developing in the East.
Yeah, the Le Pen situation is very complicated. It's very clear that France is one of the linchpins, one of the central beacons for Talmudic globalism and Freemasonry of Europe, right? It's clearly one of the main pieces on the board. And so the globalists do not want any sort of disruptions to what's happening in France. Germany has been significantly weakened. I think the fact that Germany economically has been a powerhouse, but less so militarily, also plays a large role. I think the globalists see Germany simply as this huge European factory of the world, like this, essentially like a European China of sorts. They don't really want the German people rising up in a military fashion to play any role significantly in Europe's future. But for France, it's undeniable. France has one of the most powerful armies in Europe, frankly, probably stronger than the United Kingdom. Roughly, it has nuclear reactors, it has nuclear weaponry. It's on the Security Council, significant player. They do not want a weird character potentially with ties to, figures like Alexander Dugin, et cetera, and all kinds of other questionable right-wing connections like Marine Le Pen, because these people have chatted to right-wingers all across Europe. They're potentially even sympathetic to someone like Vladimir Putin, who Vladimir Putin himself was one of these characters who came to power in Russia, and yet he sort of flirted with NATO, he flirted with liberalism, democracy, and then he kind of went on his own way. They're afraid of another character like that coming to power in France. Of course, Georgescu is the same. It's an identical situation. And of course, they search for your history. They search for the skeletons in your closet. If you're a politician running for an election in Europe, And they will, if they find something like the embezzlement case in Marine Le Pen's matter, they will, of course, bar you from running. And so that's the truth. Liberal democracy. I have to kind of cite Secretary, the spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, Peskov, when he says, look, looks like Europe isn't liberal and democratic enough. It's like, well, it's kind of saying that tongue in cheek, as you've mentioned, Conrad, prior to our recording here, but it's true. Like Europe is very much hypocritically liberal and democratic. In truth, it is an authoritarian and almost totalitarian style liberalism that reigns across and controls all these European peoples. Makes sure they dance to the fiddle of the post-enlightenment, post-modernity, which naturally all these countries are being deteriorated. Their culture is being reduced to nothing, and of course they're being culturally enriched by all the great people joining in. And one of those countries that opposes that, as you mentioned, is Hungary, right? Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has positioned himself as this figure in opposition, similar to Poland. He's in opposition to all this degeneration, but at the same time, he's happy to put on a kippah or even a black top hat, as he did at the Wailing Wall when he visited Israel a few years ago. And he's happy to invite somebody like Benjamin Netanyahu, the slayer of tens of thousands of children, to Hungary in order to discuss whatever they have to discuss in Budapest, like, the leaving the ICC, the international pressure on Israel. There are realpolitik, geopolitical considerations here. We know Hungary is not, for example, pro-Islamic by any stretch. We just have to remember like the 1683 siege of Vienna by the Ottoman Caliphate and all those hundreds of thousands of Sunni Muslims who invaded the Austro-Hungarian Holy Roman Empire and tried to destroy the European peoples, most likely tried to destroy the Hungarian people themselves. But we can't really travel that far in time without considering like recent history, right? Hungary in and of itself, despite it being somewhat based, a member of the, an ally of the Third Reich, of course, an assistant of essentially an auxiliary country within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, literally one of the main players there. This probably accounts also, Conrad, for the relationship between Dodik, Vucic, and Orban. Notice it's that Austro-Hungarian history, because Serbia was a member state of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was essentially divided between, Serbs were not just, they were a minority people within that larger Roman Catholic, Christian country. And so that's a huge consideration. Serbians were literally citizens of the Holy Roman Emperor, and Hungarians were too. So they do have that common history linking them, which is probably why Hungary, bordering Serbia, has such a, they're trying to rebuild a sort of Central European-based alliance. But in fact, I think they're relying on the wrong people. And they do so, I think, with clear knowledge. Like we look at early 20th century history, there's some very uncomfortable truths that I think pro-Hungarian nationalists need to contend with. For example, like figures like Bela Kun, the half-Jewish, half-Hungarian revolutionary who tried to turn Hungary into this Bolshevik republic just during the Russian Civil War. Bela Kun is an interesting character worth reading up on in your own time, because it's one of the main Judeo-Bolshevik demons of the revolution, who I think everybody should know by name. And what this particular character has done is like the Hungarian Lenin. Fortunately, he did not succeed. But what's interesting is Hungarians were happy to support the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, which is why we find, even Hungarian graffiti at the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, where the Romanov family was murdered. Hungarian prisoners of war from the First World War were actually happy to support the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the Jews in their fight against the Russian people. Hungarians, I'm not going to mention some sort of stereotypical cultural gripes that Russians and Ukrainians have against them, but it's not a very clear. The anti-Talmudic tendencies don't have a very clear history, let's just say that much. So it's very surprising that Orban, a European figure, seemingly someone who wants a strong, powerful sovereign Hungary, is allying himself with literally the most evil Talmudic characters such as Netanyahu himself, who literally wants to kill not just the best of Goys, but just all Goys collectively, starting with the Palestinians. It's quite bad, and this is why, frankly, we call it out directly. Orban shouldn't be dealing with these people. Dodik and Vucic shouldn't either. And no anti-Islamic rhetoric, whether it's in relation to Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Sunni Islam, or even past history, they shouldn't cloud the judgment of these politicians. And we say this, most of these anti-Islamic sentiments, of course, are in relation to the cultural enrichers across Central and Western Europe, which Dodik, Vucic, and Orban, they see that. They see what's happening to Sweden and Germany, but they don't account for the fact that there are clearly groups in power, influential people who are bringing these cultural enrichers in. This is something that Tommy Robinson didn't even mention in the UK. There's clear influential groups, NGOs, they're run by certain people. They're influential spokespersons who want the clergy diversification and the destruction of European peoples to take place. And this is why I think Conrad Orban is somewhat hypocritical, especially with figures like Netanyahu, seemingly positioning himself as like the protectors of European identity. I think this is a huge misconception, and I think Orban's a bit too smart. I don't think he's an idiot. I think he knows what he's doing, and he's willing to, in order for Hungary to prosper, he's willing to go and compromise and literally ally himself with the Jews. Partially, I think, in a very similar fashion to what Vladimir Putin has been doing in Russia over the last few years. This is probably why the Chabad rabbis are still walking around the Kremlin. And I don't think this alliance will be very fruitful in the long term. I think it's a short-term sacrifice. It's essentially a union, like the union that the Byzantine Eastern Romans went for just before the fall of Constantinople when they allied themselves with the Pope. I would say it's an identical, analogous situation. And unfortunately, we just don't learn from history, do we?
Unfortunately not. And it's disappointing that, these guys they're pretty good on these other issues. Unfortunately, the reality is they are only permitted to be as good on those other issues insofar as they, burn their pinch of incense before the Jewish emperor, as it were. So, that's what we all have to witness. But it's still good news. This is the headline. Serbia and Hungary have agreed on the terms of signing a defense agreement. Serbia and Hungary. This step is a response to the Kosovo-Albania-Croatia defense agreement. Serbia's President Alexander Vučić made a comment. Intensive military cooperation has been established between Serbia and Hungary. The Hungarian Defense Minister Christoph Saleh spoke on behalf of Hungary. Hungary has always stood for peace, and Serbia is our ally on this path. Slovakia is expected to join this agreement soon because we cannot hope for a new world order. Given the lack of common borders with Russia and the above-mentioned countries, it turns out that they have gathered to defend themselves from the NATO bloc. There's rumor, of course, that Republika Srpska's Dodik will also be involved in this agreement, and Dodik recently traveled to Russia after visiting Israel as well. So he's very much in this group with these, populist, right-wing, supposedly nationalist, pro-Israeli European politicians. Dodik also had an arrest warrant issued for him in Germany. So, he technically has, the arrest warrant from the Bosnian-Herzegovina government. Now he can't go to Germany, but, he's able to go to Israel. He's able to go to Russia. I think he's able to go to a decent amount of other places. So that's how that is developing. Of course, the Croats, everyone, all the Catholics are like, oh, but the Croatians, the based Balkan Catholics. It's like, well, much like we've talked about the Jews and the Brits and the Pope in the past, they've very much been willing to advocate and ally with the Muslim Kosovar Albanians, the Neo-Ottomans of our time, these sorts of things. So good job, Croatia. Very based, not obviously. But before we move on to Africa and some of these other fronts, we do need to talk about the massive Chinese drills. This is from the AP. Chinese military conducts large-scale drills around Taiwan. The Chinese military conducted large-scale drills in the waters and airspace around Taiwan on Tuesday that included an aircraft carrier battle group, as it again warned the self-ruled democracy against seeking formal independence. The exercise involved Navy, air, ground, and rocket forces and were meant to be a severe warning and forceful containment against Taiwan independence, according to Shi Yi, spokesperson for the People's Liberation Army Eastern Theater Command. No operational name for the drills was announced, nor previous notice given. China considers Taiwan a part of its territory to be brought under its control by force if necessary. While most Taiwanese favor their de facto independence and democratic status, well, that's not necessarily true. Any conflict could bring in the U.S., which maintains alliances in the region and is legally bound to treat threats to Taiwan as a matter of grave concern. Taiwan's presidential office posted on X that China's blatant military provocations not only threaten peace in the Taiwan Strait, but also undermine security in the entire region, as evidenced by drills near Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and the South China Sea. We strongly condemn China's escalatory behavior. So I saw many pictures and footage coming out of this. You could see the huge Chinese aircraft carrier from Taiwan. Of course, we know that the Kinmen and other islands are very close to China, which, again, within the next 5 years, I would not be surprised if those were directly taken or occupied, or if those are occupied, that would lead to a full, scale invasion of Taiwan. We know that the Trump administration, while not going so far as to say the U.S. rejects the one China policy, they definitely changed some of their State Department website language about supporting Taiwan and supporting Taiwanese independence, which, again, people need to know that the U.S., internationally at the UN, all these places considers Taiwan part of China. Taiwan is part of China. And I wouldn't be surprised that if it wasn't for U.S. interference, a pro-China, pro-reunification government may have already come to power in Taipei. So, that wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think one of the big things that people need to realize, like the article said, there was no operational name. I think there actually was there was sort of a working name that the Chinese posted. I'm forgetting what it was called. But the fact that it was unannounced, of course, is obviously to show force to Taiwan. There was a lot of threatening statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry warning the United States to not use Taiwan as a destabilizing factor with China. I wouldn't be surprised if this had something to do with the tariffs, but even more than that, I think this has to do with Iran. We know that China is Iran's number one energy purchaser, and China obviously knows that they're not necessarily capable of projecting land military power all the way across Central Asia into the Middle East to confront the United States, who already has, hundreds effectively of bases there. But they know that they can pressure Taiwan, signal towards potentially running an operation on Taiwan, getting involved militarily, which of course is going to spread the United States naval fleet thin. We know that there are 3 at one point carrier strike groups that were in the Red Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, Persian Gulf area. If the US believes that China is going to imminently move on Taiwan, they might not be able to pressure Iran as strongly as they would like. So again, I'm not saying that's China's main motivation, but I'm sure it is a factor in making sure that the United States is spread more thin. And even though United States military doctrine has always been that they claim they can fight a 2-front war against major powerful countries and still win, China's military might, specifically its Navy, with its now 3 aircraft carriers, on top of obviously what Russia's able to do on land, as shown in Ukraine, I think it's going to stretch thin that doctrine and show that I think the Americans would be smart to realize that they'd be much smarter fighting Iran and then China. But again, I'm sure the Chinese and the Iranians are having high-level discussions about all of those things. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on that, Dimitri, before we transition to Africa.
Yeah, I think the long-term aspirations of China to expand both in the South China Sea, naturally taking care of some of those shores of the Philippines as well as Taiwan, I think China is really waiting for the best opportunity to do so. And frankly, China with this alliance with Russia, some of these economic complexities that will come from the tariffs and potentially future sanctions that Trump may place on Russia will throw sort of a spanner into China's further plans, right? Because the US also has something to offer China. That is maybe some protectorship or, a long-term integration plan of Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, into their sphere of influence. Potentially, we have to keep this in mind. We spoke about these huge trades geopolitically that may take place. For example, Trump's deal with Russia in order for Russia to stop supporting Iran, right? That's like a really big consideration on the table. And against Russia, China and Trump could, again, leverage Taiwan. But Trump could say, look, we'll facilitate a long-term integration between the Chinese peoples of Taiwan and mainland China, but you need to stand with us against Russia, with whom, you do trade in terms of lumber, in terms of gas and oil, but come on, that's nothing compared to our relationship with China at the moment, their infrastructure, their industry, and the money traveling between America and mainland China is, of course, insane. It dwarfs the trade taking place between China and the States. This may also, of course, impact, this deal of Taiwan in the future, because the conflict may not result in, of course, a full-scale amphibian operation and like a special military operation of China on Taiwan, Conrad. Taiwan may be slowly integrated, similar to Hong Kong, into China's sphere of influence through Trump's dealings. We also have to consider China's trading with Iran as well. Iran naturally exports most of its goods to China. China is one of its largest trade partners. Iran is one of America's main enemies at the moment. It's already openly stated that Iran is one of those places where the US may potentially strike in the future in order to secure, as allegedly Israel's sovereignty and safety in the near future. So I think China and Taiwan, they greatly also relate to the Russo-Ukrainian war and the Middle East very strongly. It's not an isolated Oriental theater by any stretch of the imagination, but especially considering how Trump handles himself. You can clearly see the entire world map, right, in front of him, and he's using these various points in order to move the pieces. And we know Trump's probably not acting alone. He has advisors, he has think tanks, he probably has influential Talmudic rabbis as well whispering into his ears. And so I think China's also willing to cooperate. It's always been China very much is it's a trade-heavy, mercantile civilization. It's not a military conquest style culture by any stretch of the imagination. China's always been famous for its agriculture, its industry, producing things, textiles, etc. It's not really famous for conquering the entire world, as it's never done. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think Trump will play to the strengths of China diplomatically in order to bring them over to his side.
I agree. And I think Trump has sanctioned Taiwan. He's made it clear that he wants to break free of dependence on, Taiwan's semiconductor industry. And if that actually is successful at the domestic level, then potentially I could see Trump, brokering this relationship. Unfortunately, the China hawks in his Pentagon and State Department are not going to want to go along with that. I'm not saying all of them want to escalate to a war with China, but they want to contain China. They want to contain it as, it's sort of the closest thing that could rival America as both a land and a sea power in that way. So it's very much, it's the real superpower threat, not Russia and Iran per se. China, obviously, with its population and economic base, and of course, its shipbuilding, manufacturing, military, industrial complex is what really frightens the Americans. But the fight for Africa is very much tied in, of course, with the battle against China, obviously the battle against Russia as well, specifically in North and West Africa. The situation between the Americans and Russians is very much a proxy there. And of course, we've talked many times in the past about the Libyan civil war, which technically isn't quote unquote ongoing, even though there are occasional clashes. The country is just partitioned between the Libyan House of Representatives that's supported by the Libyan National Army versus, I believe it's the Government of National Accord or something like that, which is based in Tripoli. These governments, respectively, the LNA, which is Khalifa Haftar, he was backed by Russia, by Egypt, in some cases even by the United States, France perhaps, and then meanwhile, the side that was against them, the Tripoli-based government, were backed by Turkey. Some have accused it of, Hamas, these Muslim Brotherhood-aligned forces, of supporting the Tripoli-based government. But in a somewhat surprising turn of events, this is from Rerum Novarum, a surprise visit by Saddam Haftar, son of Russian-backed Libyan National Army commander Khalifa Haftar, to Ankara, Turkey, where he met with Turkish Defense Minister Yasar Güler. So perhaps Turkey is hoping to, normalize with Russia, normalize with these other groups by abandoning the Tripoli government. They've realized maybe they want Haftar to entirely take over. I'm not sure. I guess this could be a sign potentially even towards Israel that they, we're not supporting this quote unquote Muslim Brotherhood aligned government. I'm not sure the exact angle here, but, this is very interesting. So we're going to be covering this and keeping our eyes on this because, again, this has been one of those many proxies where Russia and Turkey have clashed, much like in Syria, much like in, you could say Cyprus, not really, but religiously speaking Cyprus, and then, multiple other places where, of course, Turkey both goes against Iran and goes against Russia. But one of the big stories coming out of Africa that we definitely need to discuss is the situation in Congo with Rwanda. And people remember in the past how I talked about the Jewish mineral magnate of the Congo, who was named Dan Gertler, I believe was his name, this filthy Hasid. And I had mentioned how we had been hearing about those supposed beheadings of Christians in the Congo by these apparently Ugandan or Rwandan aligned groups, and how apparently, sort of almost a warmongering to get involved against Rwanda as they incur into Congo, which again, most of the DRC is anarchic jungle wasteland. This idea that the Kinshasa government has any kind of centralized control is ridiculous. But Nick Fuentes also started talking about this. He said on X, it has just been reported that Congo is paying pro-Israel conservatives millions of dollars to lobby the Trump admin to go to war against Rwanda. So if you've seen any posts about Christian beheadings in Congo lately, that was almost certainly an undisclosed paid post. Karen Giorno, a fanatical Zionist neocon, has been paid $5 million by the DRC to lobby Trump to support its war against Rwanda. Nothing says America first like going to war in Yemen, Iran, and Central Africa. These people will literally work for any country other than America. And of course, there are evidence that Giorno was, paid by the Congo. There are the receipts. And I found a very interesting piece in the National Interest published on April 1st with the headline, Maximum Pressure on Rwanda Represents a Strategic Critical Minerals Opportunity for the United States. The United States can secure access to the Democratic Republic of Congo's strategic critical minerals by enacting a maximum pressure strategy to confront Rwanda's support for M23, helping to stabilize the region and counter China's growing influence. The National Interest, of course, is, very aggressive pro-American empire. On March 17th, peace talks rescheduled in Angola between the DRC and Rwanda-backed M23 insurgency collapsed. Sanctions imposed by the European Union against senior members of both M23 and the Rwandan militia RDF led to Rwanda pulling out of the talks and cutting diplomatic ties with Brussels. The failure of negotiations nevertheless led to a March 14th meeting in Qatar between Presidents Tshisekedi and Kagame, although a post-meeting communique showed very little hope for a swift and decisive agreement. Obviously, this goes on to say, and it references the fact that the DRC earlier, we covered it, 2 shows ago, maybe 3, that they presented an offer to basically give very generous mineral rights to the United States in this specific region in eastern Congo where the Rwandan-backed M23 militias are moving. And of course, this is ultimately relies on, I believe, the real root cause that, Israeli-aligned conservatives are being the ones deployed to do this, or the fact that Dan Gertler, an Israeli Hasidim, is the one that needs his bases and his mines protected by, the international mercenary group that is the United States military. And so I don't know if we're going to see, maybe we'll see Blackwater deployed, much like Russia has deployed a Wagner across Africa, but maybe we'll see some private military contractors or, some kind of U.S. backed force or another coalition of the willing, to make this real. But the article goes on to say a substantial amount of the DRC's critical mineral supply, particularly coltan, continues to be in M23's crosshairs, pursuing a war that has clearly become entirely about access to the DRC's critical minerals. Ongoing M23 actions have thwarted Kinshasa's plan to develop the coltan sector by building a refinery with a capacity of 100 tons per month of tantalum salt for export. So obviously, coltan is critical in the production of manufacturing. The strategic offer put forward by DRC President Tshisekedi to President Trump has sought to change this calculus, with untapped resources in the DRC estimated to be valued at upwards of $24 trillion. The DRC is offering preferential access to much-needed strategic critical minerals for American industry, particularly the defense sector. So obviously, as the U.S. also realizes that its capacity to build ships and other military assets is dwindling in the face of Chinese and even Russian production capability, they're going to want to secure a lot more of these African resources, especially as China, closes in on Central Africa from all sides with its, much less overbearing and libtarded demands when it works with African countries. So this was interesting. We'd covered this in the past. I'm glad to see this, vindicated on this coming to fruition. Of course, fundamentally, it's always the Jews and it's always Israel. I mean, as I much hate to say it, that's how these things go. But the other news from Africa, of course, from the AP, Russia hosts top diplomats from Sahel countries for talks on boosting security ties. And this, of course, Lavrov welcomed the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These countries are becoming very strong Russian allies. Mali even went so far to say, this is from TASS, Mali regards Ukraine as a terrorist state. According to Abdoulaye Diop, the Sahel states and Russia have common approaches and views on security issues and equally recognize and see how it is necessary to fight terrorism to ensure security in the region. For us, Ukraine is a terrorist state, he said. The terrorists in the Sahel, according to the minister, are supported by external regional actors who are in the region, help them, and organize a rear for them. For example, in Ukraine. Ukraine is a backer of terrorism and it must be stopped. So, these countries, specifically the new Sahel alliance that has left ECOWAS, which ECOWAS now is pretty much just the coastal West African countries, the big landlocked countries of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have formed their own alliance of Sahel states and are very much in the Russian sphere of influence. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the situation in Africa, Dimitri, before we talk about Austin Metcalf and then some church news.
Yes, of course. I think Libya is very much the big surprise, right? We didn't really see Libya coming into world affairs anytime soon after the desecration and the depopulation of Libya. Literal slave trade was taking place there after the 2011 NATO intervention and the revolution that took place and deposed Muammar Gaddafi. But if we recall, Gaddafi's economy in Libya, essentially this autarkic system that he set up over the decades of the 20th century, it did come into fruition and turn the land into quite a prosperous, the state became quite prosperous despite the fact that, technically speaking, they literally were not just the third world, it was like the fourth world at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't anything noteworthy. It was essentially a land full of Bedouins and very similar to northern Mali, for example. But Libya, as geopolitical country at the moment, led by Field Marshal Haftar, I think it's trying to position itself between some of the main power players in the region. In, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, right? We have Haftar sending his children to Turkey, sending them to Israel. For example, the son of Haftar, Saddam Haftar, a very interesting name. And I'll say why. The name Saddam, of course, reminds us of Saddam Hussein. And Haftar himself is very similar to Hussein because he's very much this Libyan nationalist who is a little bit anti-Islamic in terms of he's maybe like a Lukashenko. He's not quite religious, just as Lukashenko isn't, he respects orthodoxy, but he isn't orthodox himself. Haftar respects Islam, but he's not an Islamist by any stretch, which is probably a good thing. But Gaddafi was the same, you could almost say. And of course, Haftar cooperating, sending his son Saddam first to Israel in 2021, then sending him to Turkey just now this week to discuss military affairs. I think it speaks a lot to the fact that he's willing to talk to both sides, both the Muslim Brotherhood, right, who hold a lot of authority in Turkey, as well as the Israeli counterparts. But the interesting factor here is that Egypt, they share 1,000 kilometers of border. In Egypt's west and, of course, Libya's east, they're both attached. They control that North African region. Egypt has a much stronger army than Libya, and Egypt is vehemently anti-Islamist in a similar way to Haftar. However, of course, Turkey is anti-Egyptian. So it's interesting why, I think even in July last year, yes, July 2024, you had the other son of Haftar. Notice Haftar, just like Lukashenko, he has multiple sons and he appoints them to key positions in his government, both in the military, in the reconstruction, economics wing. So one of his sons, Belgasim Haftar, actually visited Turkey in July 2024. So you have multiple family members visiting Turkey over and over again, cooperating with an enemy of Egypt, literally Libya's border state, which is very interesting to see how the Haftar family will try to manage this new country that they have the majority of control over. And I think in the near future, we'll see Libya maybe consolidate itself. Perhaps Haftar will win some sort of elections in the near future. Perhaps he'll be elected as the president, not just as this field marshal dictator, like a Saddam Hussein type figure. But I think Libya in the future, it'll be important for two reasons. One of which is, of course, gas, the grain stream pipeline traveling from Libya for essentially Central Africa all the way to Italy, Sicily, and southern Italy, all the way to Sicily and southern Europe, providing, of course, the much-needed gas imports that Europeans depend on. And the other consideration that Libya, of course, holds for world affairs, and in particular European domestic affairs, is the cultural enrichment. More important than the gas pipeline is the human pipeline, right? The pipeline of sub-Saharan Africans and all kinds of other members of maybe the Islamic family who continuously stream into Europe on these boats. And Haftar, if he can keep that under control, or if he has essentially, just like the OPEC countries have control of the oil valve, Haftar will control the human valve of these cultural enrichers. And so it'll be interesting to see exactly who has the most impact on him. The other thing I think Russians should be very aware of is the fact that Haftar, in his military dealings with Turkey, which is definitely, according to the prophecies, will be an enemy of Russia in the future, who will have more influence over Libya? Will it be Turkey, which is at the moment strengthening its fleet, which will hold dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean? Or will it be Russia? Because these two countries most likely will not coexist, will not hold equal number of bases in Libya. I think one of those countries will win out. So who will have more dominance over the Libyan military affairs? We know that Russia is heavily invested into Libya. But with Turkish future investment, I think we'll see exactly who will come out on top. And, it's a very interesting nation. Certainly isn't central, but as an auxiliary country, which has, definitely impact on the entire Mediterranean and Middle Eastern European affairs, it is that sort of bridgehead that I think we'll discuss for many episodes going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how that field marshal consolidates his reign over this unruly land. And, for better or for worse, the field marshal himself, not being an Islamist, not being a head chopper, for the local Christians of Libya, who are in a very small minority, right? Mind you, we've seen ISIS behead those Coptic martyrs, of course, during the ones that they kidnapped over 10 years ago now. I think the anniversary actually took place recently. We don't want that to happen again. So in some regards, maybe it's better that a secular dictator rules the land rather than some jihadi Islamist, just from a very general Christian perspective. So a lot to consider in that particular area of the world.
No, it's very true. I agree. Libya it wasn't necessarily at the top of my list for things that might get resolved or might come into play here, but we have been covering it just in case something like this occurs. But you mentioned head chopping and stabbing and knives. I hate to say this, trying to find a transition here, and I'm probably going to talk about this more in my World War live stream this coming Tuesday, so I may not go into extensive detail, but of course the internet is ablaze talking about the news of Austin Metcalf, the high-achieving football star from Frisco, Texas, not too far from where I'm at right now, a few hours away, who was stabbed at a track meet by a magician, a magical man named Carmelo Anthony, a black individual. Both of these kids were 17, I believe. He was stabbed in the heart and bled to death in his twin brother's arms. This was at a track meet. The two kids didn't go to the same school. They didn't know each other. And the report, of course, is that the black kid was sitting down, had his backpack out under one of the tents for the school that he didn't go to. He was asked to move. And again, everyone's debating, did Austin attack him first? And again, let's say that Austin literally did start attacking this guy after he didn't leave. That is not a justification to pull out a knife at a school track meet and stab somebody to death. But the report that I'm seeing that seems to be somewhat pointing towards the truth, what it says is Anthony told Metcalf, "Touch me and see what happens." Metcalf reportedly then touched Anthony, the witness told a responding officer, and Anthony told Metcalf to punch him and see what would happen. It then says that Metcalf grabbed Anthony to tell him to move, at which point the affidavit continues. Anthony pulled out what the witnesses recalled as a black knife and stabbed Metcalf once in the chest before running away. Metcalf reportedly started grabbing his chest and telling people to get help, the witness told police. And again, This is a black kid who's pictured holding guns, holding up a lighter and his middle finger on social media, whereas Austin Metcalf is a high achieving, athletic football star who had his whole life ahead of him. And of course, we're seeing there's that Department of Justice task force, I believe they're called like the CRS or something, that it seems have already been dispatched. You have this kid's father already saying, like, I've already forgiven this black kid and you can't judge his bad decision, which, again, these DOJ forces get out there to make sure that rightfully angered white people don't actually rise up and do something about this, because at this point, the discourse online, the discourse around this, conservatives are much more keyed into this stuff in the post-George Floyd era. I mean, we're hearing talk about segregation. We're hearing people that you would never think talking about this, talking about repealing the civil rights legislation and just protecting white people from this senseless violence. And of course, it's disgusting seeing all the there's black people defending this online, obviously, like black people with their full face and name praising Carmelo Anthony for murdering Austin Metcalf. Carmelo Anthony's father is saying that you judging my son already. He didn't do nothing, pretty much all that kind of nonsense. So, that's what's happening right now. This is, of course, a tragedy. Some people might even call it rage bait, but it's important to talk about this stuff. And again, I've been, online, everybody's like, nobody's talking about the roots of the cause. The more sensible black people are like, man, you blaming all black people for this, man. You ain't addressing the root causes, man. What about the cycle of poverty and the school to prison pipeline? All these, nonsensical talking points cooked up by libtarded white people and Jews. When in reality, if you just look at, for example, the poorest white American town and the richest black American town, for example, Beattyville, Kentucky, the poorest white American town, has a median income of less than $15,000, and the violent crime rate per 100,000 people is 158. The property crime rate being 946 per 100,000 residents. Meanwhile, the wealthiest black American city, Windsor Hills, California, with a median income of almost $160,000, have a violent crime rate of 196 per 100,000 people and a property crime rate of 1,974 per 100,000 people. So very much higher statistics of crime in supposedly the wealthiest, most well-to-do places that have supposedly escaped the cycle of poverty, the cycle of violence. They're still way more violent than the trashiest white people living in rural Kentucky. So explain that one to me, black people. Explain to me why we should live with you, because I'm not seeing the benefit, frankly. But I think I'll discuss that more on my stream on Tuesday. Be sure to tune into that. Might be a go-off moment from your boy. So just overall, just a senseless tragedy. And unfortunately, everyone's saying, stop making this about race. It is about race. And if we don't do something and at least allow certain groups of people to start separating themselves and give them a carte blanche license to actually do that and create towns and cities where we don't have to deal with this nonsense, then none of this is going to change. But if you have any thoughts on that, Dimitri, go ahead. But we also have to discuss church news here before we wrap up the show.
Yeah, I think you've covered that in depth. I entirely agree with this helter-skelter type scenario that took place in America, a tragedy. And frankly, people are just not open-minded enough or willing or brave enough and courageous enough to speak about the impact that black gangster culture has had on American people. And frankly, hopefully you'll discuss this in depth on your live 8-hour episode, and I'll be definitely watching that and probably even commenting and reflecting on that. So can't wait. But in relation to, helter-skelter and all kinds of things going wrong, in Ukraine at the moment, there's the entire debacle taking place in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra caves, the central monastery of Kiev, the first Lavra, the largest monastery in Russian history, probably the first place of Russian monasticism. Not the first sort of monastery built on Russian land by any stretch. There were already monasteries in Crimea. And of course, since probably the times of St. Andrew the Apostle, there were all kinds of saints living in the Russian lands. But however, the first official large-scale monastery is the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra caves, which are being currently desecrated. There are literally there's a Ukrainian vet, there are Ukrainian scientists, lab coats investigating the relics, taking DNA samples, things like that, in order to use their scientific method ways to uncover the truth about who the saints in the Ukrainian Kiev-Pechersk Lavra caves are. And I mean, this is a Bolshevik-style desecration, similar to what the Bolsheviks did to the relics of all kinds of Russian saints, frankly, throughout the 1920s. It's essentially identical. And we had several church figures. There were a really senior archpriest from the Odessa diocese, which we know is very pro-Ukrainian, the canonical church. The archpriest spoke out against this. He made a video essentially stating that the Ukrainian church is committing an offense against some of the relics that belong to the Ukrainian people and Christianity in this land, which is entirely true. This is one of the most senior Ukrainian bishops, actually, Metropolitan Anthony Pakanich. He's the secretary of Metropolitan Onufry. He operates essentially everything that Metropolitan Onufri doesn't essentially control, he does. So he's like his right or left-hand man. He released like a short voice clip comparing the Ukrainian government to the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, who persecuted the Hebrews. A really interesting comparison, I would say, correctly so. Zelensky is literally the pharaoh from the Old Testament. He is this persecutor of the righteous and the Orthodox in the Ukrainian land. But never before has a senior person as high up as Metropolitan Onufri's, personal sort of synod have they criticized the Ukrainian government with such vehement words. And I think this is a change. And frankly, unfortunately, we haven't seen an official statement from the Ukrainian Orthodox Synod condemning the desecration or even the persecution of Christianity, openly speaking. We've not had any strong words. Metropolitan Onufri has remained silent on exactly what's taking place with the relics. So it'll be interesting to see how that situation develops. Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, who we speak about very often, he's at the moment actually in Zaporozhye itself. He traveled from Melitopol back to his Ukrainian-occupied home city in order to be with his people and his flock and the priest whose spiritual father he is. He releases these video clips every week. In this particular clip, he discusses what is the point of the Ukrainian government desecrating the relics of the Kiev-Pechersk caves. He says that their goal is to identify relics and proclaim that some of them are actually do not belong to those saints, whom they claim to belong to, and to produce DNA results, to even claim that some of the saints some of the saint relics belong to animals, highly sacrilegious sort of statement, and that they are either fake or have been replaced over time. We do know that not everything is clear in terms of Ukrainian saint relics. Like, there are a lot of saints from early Russian history. We know their relics are missing. For example, our famous and beloved Saint Olga, right? Saint Vladimir of Kiev's grandmother, the mother of Sviatoslav, her relics actually went missing in the 1700s, mysteriously out of one of the Kiev churches. They're still unknown where they exactly are, so they're completely gone. The relics of Saint Boris and Gleb, the first passion bearers in Orthodox Church history, they're also missing, most likely destroyed, and they would have been destroyed during the Batu Khan Mongol invasion of 1240, when the city of Kiev was besieged and then burnt down. Essentially, many cathedrals, churches were destroyed, including one of the main sepulchres inside of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra caves, where a lot of other relics were also destroyed. We know that the two founding monks of the Kiev-Pechersk caves, Theodosius and Anthony, I believe St. Anthony's relics still remain in the Kiev-Pechersk caves. However, St. Theodosius's relics also went missing all the way back in 1240. So this is a big question mark to all the Eurasianist bros who proclaim the Mongols were an enriching element in Russian culture. I'll just have them read church history and exactly how many people the Mongols actually slaughtered. Some people claim that close to 40% of the Russian population was destroyed. Thousands of towns and villages and major cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, Kiev, Chernigov, all these ancient princedoms and cathedrals, monasteries desecrated by those Mongol Eurasianist cultural enrichers, right, who helped Russia and helped us. This was all buffoonery, right? Eurasianism is essentially a fraudulent idea thrown in order to distract white Russian Orthodox Christians from restoring the future monarchy that is supposed to stand up against the Antichrist system. So, but not getting too distracted from that, we also note that Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, he actually stated that he's willing to personally forgive any OCU schismatic priests, bishops, or deacons as well as laity who come over back to the canonical church. He says that, look, the only issue we have to resolve is the hierotonia question. So who exactly blessed or who performed the laying of hands on some of these clergymen? But if that question can be resolved, perhaps there could be some ceremonies of blessing that could take place over some of these priests who were maybe made clergymen under the uncanonical schismatic church. But he says that once that question is resolved, we're willing to forgive them, and all these schismatics can come into the fold and we can reunite the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which I think generally is a positive message. I did note that some Orthodox Russians were pretty upset Metropolitan Luke was trying to take this very conciliatory approach. They said, look, a lot of these priests and clergymen literally called for a genocide of Russians. They called for very militaristic acts against the Russian Orthodox Church. They're Russophobic in their very nature. A lot of these schismatic priests are very much not of the character that you'd want a clergyman to be. They're not honorable by any stretch. They're very unbecoming of the role. Perhaps they shouldn't even ever be taken into the canonical church. I would say in the future, hopefully, if Russia ever liberates all of Ukraine, there'll be a big question as to what to do with all these schismatic priests. Can you kind of somehow bring them back into canonicity through some sort of blessing ritual. A lot of thick discussions in that particular regard, I would say quite dense in terms of information. But the analogy historically could be the iconoclasm controversy. So many iconoclasts returned back to the canonical church in Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire after that heretical controversy. They came from not just schism, but actual heresy. They were icon destroyers, but they repented and they came back to the Orthodox Church. So I think that's maybe a good example that in the future Ukrainian hierarchs can bring to the table in order to resolve this issue. But again, this is very deeply theoretical. The war is not over, and the persecution is surely only just beginning, as we can see, because Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, we mention quite often, he stated that the city of Cherkasy only have 3 Orthodox churches left that are canonical. Notice the diocese of Cherkasy is much larger, but there are also towns, villages. This is where most of the priests are from. In the city of Cherkasy itself, the capital city, it's 260,000 people large. So it's not very big, especially by American standards. And in fact, a lot of people probably sought refuge. So I would say the city's population is much smaller than that, maybe 200,000 at this point. Only 3 out of 10 churches in the city belong to the canonical church, to Metropolitan Theodosius and his priests and his deacons that help him out. 7 out of 10 have been already occupied by the OCU, and including that Archangel Michael Cathedral, the footage of which we saw a few months ago when we saw Orthodox Christians being beaten and them trying to defend the church, and of course a huge act of desecration and sacrilege, which we all saw clear footage of by the Ukrainian authorities and this Banderite militia. So Metropolitan Theodosius said that yes, we won't be giving any more churches over to the schismatics. But I would just want to note, 4 or 5 days ago, just before this particular statement by him, he gave an interesting sermon to which he said that we Orthodox Christians do not condone any violent defense of our parishes. We won't be beating up Ukrainian militiamen or using weapons in order to defend our churches. So kind of maybe a more pacifistic take he gave earlier this week. I would say if you want to defend those 3 remaining parishes, you very much need to at least use some sort of force, barring people from entering the church, pushing them away, maybe using some sort of, I'm not claiming, cold steel or firearms, but at least you do need to, prevent them from physically entering into the altar and taking your antimins, your relics, and some of your miracle working icons, as well as other holy things. So I think Metropolitan Theodosius is very much struggling to hold his diocese together, especially in the capital city of Cherkasy. So the persecution is very clearly on the way. And I think we all await an opening statement from Metropolitan Onufri and his synod condemning not just the desecration of the relics, but the persecution caused by Zelensky in the first place. I think he's very much struggling to balance between, affirming Zelensky as a legitimate president of Ukraine, and hopefully through that means Metropolitan Onufri can have the persecution die down kind of organically and naturally. And on the other hand, of course, we all see what's taking place, and it seems like the church leadership in Ukraine, the canonical church, is not very stalwart in defending their own flock, or at least in proclaiming some sort of defensive position, stating that, look, we're under persecution right now, we should all pray for an end to persecution. At the moment, all the canonical churches of Ukraine are praying for the victory of Zelensky over the Russian forces, not an end to the persecution. So very concerning. And I think going forward, I think we should all keep those particular parishes, all those lay persons, the millions of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine in our prayers, because if all goes according to plan, in June of 2025, the official systematic closing of all canonical Orthodox churches will begin across the Zelensky-occupied, Kyiv regime-occupied Ukrainian land. So this is when that stalemate that we've discussed for a few months now will end. And in June of this year, the Ukrainian government will begin not just taking one church here and a cathedral there, they'll begin shutting down hundreds, maybe thousands of churches systematically, and they will use literally probably the military apparatus to do so. So very scary times ahead.
They realize the error of their ways and will stop supporting the schismatics and the satanic Jewish Zelensky government. But no, they continue to double down. This is from Ortho Christian. Archons of Constantinople to give Mike Pompeo Human Rights Award. The Archons of the Patriarch of Constantinople have announced that this year's recipient of the Athenagoras Human Rights Award will be former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The award will be presented on October 18th at the New York Milton Midtown Hotel, the Archons report. As in past years, the award focuses on how the awardee has served the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Archon National Commander Anthony Limbrakis explains that Pompeo has consistently demonstrated a heartfelt and deeply informed concern for the rights of the ecumenical patriarchate and all of the religious minorities in Turkey, as well for the plight of all those around the world who have suffered for exercising their freedom of conscience. The announcement recalls Pompeo's meetings with Patriarch Bartholomew and Archbishop Elpidophoros during his tenure as Secretary of State. According to Limbrakis, he is a staunch and steadfast defender of human rights. Pompeo also spoke at an Archons conference in 2024. The announcement recalls at which he praised Patriarch Bartholomew for granting autocephaly to the OCU. During his time as Secretary of State, Pompeo met with and expressed support for quote-unquote Metropolitan Epiphany Dumenko and other OCU leaders. Dumenko is himself a former recipient of the Archons Human Rights Award, although his organization openly and violently persecutes the Orthodox Christians of Ukraine. Pompeo has publicly acknowledged that with his help, the U.S. pressured for international recognition of the schismatic OCU, and OCU bishops themselves have openly stated that Patriarch Bartholomew was able to create the OCU in 2018 only because he had U.S. support. Several months ago, Pompeo was pranked by famous Russian pranksters Vovan and Lexus, thinking he was speaking with former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. The former Secretary of State said about the creation of the OCU, "I know, I was in the middle of it. I'm so proud of what happened. By the way, I think it has made a difference in the war. So I give His All Holiness Bartholomew and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, meaning OCU, leadership, major honor for what they did." And in his view, the idea that Zelensky and the OCU leadership are persecuting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is nutso. Other past recipients of the Athenagoras Human Rights Award include Patriarch Theodore of Alexandria, former governor of New York Andrew Cuomo, and President Joe Biden. So the Archons definitely are not people you should be respecting or paying any heed to. And Pompeo, thankfully he's no longer in power at all because he foolishly explored the possibility of running against Trump in the Republican primary. So Trump obviously did not appreciate that. Some other persecution news, of course, in Estonia, the Estonian church was able to agree on its new name and initially stave off persecution, but apparently the judiciary in Estonia is continuing to try to persecute them, which is unfortunate, so keep them in your prayers. But I want to end on some good church news. This is also from Ortho Christian. Historic event, Antiochian Patriarch serves with Jerusalem bishops, first time since communion resumed. A historic event took place on Friday, March 28th, as the primate of the Antiochian Patriarchate concelebrated with hierarchs of the Jerusalem Patriarchate for the first time since communion was restored between the ancient churches after nearly a decade in the fall of 2023. Moreover, the joint prayers rang out in the Jerusalem Patriarchate's Cathedral of Saints Isaac the Syrian, George, and Makarios of Jerusalem in Doha, Qatar, which is notable because it was precisely the question of which patriarchate rightfully holds ecclesiastical jurisdiction over Qatar that caused the break in communion in the first place. The Antiochian Synod broke communion with the Church of Jerusalem on April 29, 2014, after the latter consecrated Archimandrite Makarios as its Metropolitan of Qatar. On October 30th, 2023, the Antiochians resolved to restore communion, understanding that the current circumstances of war require intensification of prayer and cooperation. However, the Qatar issue remains unresolved. So this is great to see. Obviously, one of the few benefits from October 7th and Israel's crackdown of persecutions on Christians has been the resumption of communion between two of the most ancient patriarchates of the Orthodox Church, the Antiochians and the Jerusalem Patriarchate, two members of that original pentarchy of the five, original sees of the Holy Orthodox Church. So this is great to see, especially that it's not just that they're putting to side a grievous issue, they are concelebrating with the very bishop that supposedly was the casus belli, as it were, for the schism. So it seems the Antiochians in particular are very aware that we need unity and are willing to, I don't know if they're going to be willing to cede Qatar to Jerusalem, but it seems that they are potentially open to that in the face of, restoring Orthodox unity. So that is what we love to see. I don't have any more church updates. It's been a really good show. I think this was a great episode. Dimitri, do you have any final words and thoughts?
Yeah, no, it has been an amazing episode. Certainly a lot taking place in the world. I think we'll cover things more deeply on our Telegram in more detail. Definitely keep an eye out. We do repost a lot of the key news stories that we discuss in the next week's episode in our Telegram chats. So definitely keep an eye out on that. Join the Discord. Of course, the community is growing. And just some food for thought, Conrad, if the Greater Israel Project does reach its culmination according to those maps as seen on the badges and arm patches of those Israeli IDF soldiers, Israel will be the only nation state in the world which will have two patriarchates within its borders. And that is quite apocalyptic to consider if you think about exactly the Islamic conquest, and since the fact of the Byzantine Empire no longer existing, you'll have both the Antiochian Patriarchate as well as that of Jerusalem within the border states of future Greater Israel. And that's quite scary. Of course, so much of Orthodox Christianity being under the influence of this evil Talmudic power. So hopefully, God forbid, this is pushed back or kept until the end times, because we don't want a scenario like that to play out anytime soon.
No, I completely agree. And I want to thank everybody for making it to the very end of this episode. You're the real supporters that, we appreciate those that, consider our analysis near and dear to their hearts. So thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, obviously get behind the paywall and hear all of our premium content at this point. Almost 75 episodes, hundreds and hundreds of hours of ether hour discussions on history, controversial subjects, uncanonized saints, philosophical items that we like to explore. So worldwarnow.co is where you can support us, worldwarnow.substack.com. Again, get behind the paywall. And, it keeps these free shows going for everybody as well to, stay enlightened and stay informed on the ongoing Third World War. So keep us in your prayers as well. You can obviously find us on YouTube. The World War Now YouTube channel is where I've been going live every Tuesday evening at 7:45 p.m. Central Standard Time, discussing, cultural things as well as the latest in World War III as a sort of midweek update between the Ether Hours and World War Now episodes. So be sure to check that out as well. Set a reminder for whenever I go live. It will be greatly appreciated. Be sure to like this episode as well, wherever you are listening. All the likes are greatly appreciated. Be sure to share with anybody that might be interested. Be sure to follow us on X, World War Now _. My live stream is also live there on Tuesday evenings. Hopefully in the future, we'll be live on Substack, just waiting for them to add desktop streaming. Be sure to follow me on X as well at GnomeRad. I'm closing in on 10,000 followers, so help me get there. Follow Dimitri at WWN host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram as well, World War Now Telly. That's where we keep a 24/7, news feed about everything going on in the Third World War running. So be sure to check all of that out. Again, worldwarnow.co. That is where you can support us. Check out the latest Ether Hour this week with Anthony of Westgate and get behind the paywall to hear the full discussion on the Jewish roots of the Protestant Reformation. You don't want to miss that one. But with all of that, again, thank you so much for tuning in. Keep the persecuted churches around the world in your prayers. Keep us in your prayers as well. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.